Hey guys, tonight we're doing that thing again. Digging into the kind of history nobody asked for, but you secretly love to fall asleep to. We're heading back to a world that's just clawed its way out of a nightmare. The Black Death has finally stopped chewing through the population, and Europe's sitting there like, what now? You, my friend, have survived. No one really knows how. Maybe it was your remote village. Maybe you drank from the right well. Maybe you were just weirdly immune. But here you are, blinking in the grey light of a changed continent surrounded by silence where the familiar used to be. You probably won't survive this next part either, because the world is spiralling through a mess of consequences. But let's be real, you're used to that by now. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, what time is it where you are? And what city are you drifting off from tonight? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up in a village that smells of wood smoke and damp earth. The air feels too light, too quiet. You notice the birds chirping because they're the only ones making any noise. No carts creaking by, no shouting, no market stalls, just empty doorways and a lot of wind. The Black Death, the Great Mortality, the Plague, whatever you want to call it, has burned its way through Europe like a divine forest fire. Somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of everyone is gone. You've buried your family, or maybe you didn't. Maybe they disappeared. Maybe you fled and never looked back. Either way, you're alive, and the place you once knew isn't the same. Villages sit abandoned like forgotten board games. Fields that once swayed with golden wheat are waist-deep in weeds. Cattle roam feral. You pass a church and the door's hanging off its hinges. The priest? Long gone. Probably buried in a mass grave on the hillside, or still lying behind the altar, which is covered in dust and candles that burned out months ago. You walk through town and your boots scuff the dirt. You don't see a single child. You don't hear laughter. Instead, there's a cart half-loaded with hay, stopped mid-errand like the driver just vanished in the middle of a sentence. And that's how it is, everywhere you go. It's hard to describe the psychological weight of it all. It's not just grief, it's disorientation. Imagine your phone buzzing every 5 seconds for 2 years with news that someone else is gone. Imagine funerals every day, and then suddenly the buzz stops. The silence is worse. You find a cottage that's unlocked. There's bread mouldy on the table, a doll slumped against the hearth. No one's coming back, so you make a fire, air it out, and call it home. That's just what you do now. The old rules? Gone. The manor lord? Dead. The taxes? Uncollected. It's a reset button for better or worse. And here's a quirky little footnote to this dystopian reset. Many people in remote areas didn't even know the plague had ended. With so many dead and communication broken, it took years in some places to realise the worst had passed. Some folks holed up for so long they missed entire shifts in society. Imagine crawling out of your survival hut in the Alps and finding out not just your town, but your whole feudal system is over. That's the thing. Time itself starts to feel weird. In some places, people just stop counting. Some towns don't even track what year it is anymore. Calendars, records, who kept those and who survived to maintain them? It's all a bit fuzzy, which becomes a serious problem when you're trying to govern, inherit property, or just celebrate something without accidentally doing it on the wrong week. And yet humans adapt like mould on old cheese. Fast. Survivors like you start figuring things out. Maybe you team up with others and start a new hamlet. Maybe you head into a city, London, Paris, Florence, to see what's left. There's danger, sure, but also opportunity. For the first time in your life, the social ladder looks climbable. Slippery, yes, but possible. One historical footnote worth mentioning. After the plague, many towns and manors were so depopulated that local leaders started offering incentives to attract new residents. Some gave out free land. Others promised freedom from old labour dues. You could walk into a town and suddenly be its most valuable citizen just because you could use a shovel and weren't actively dying. But this era wasn't all about eerie opportunity. Let's pause for one of those lovely academic debates that historians can't stop poking at. Did the plague really change everything, or was it just a short-term shake-up? Some argue it paved the way for the Renaissance and the collapse of feudalism. Others say, slow down, medieval institutions were already wobbling, and the plague just knocked the teacup off the shelf a little faster. Who's right? You don't care. You're trying to decide if you want to loot a nearby orchard or fix the hole in your thatch roof before it rains again. In this hushed new world, even the animals act differently. Dogs without masters follow you around. Cats multiply. Rats, the original villains of this whole mess, are still thriving, by the way. Some things never change. And here's a haunting little fact for you to tuck under your pillow. In many towns, bells stopped ringing entirely. No one left to ring them. No one left to mourn. Churches became silent tombs, and silence became the new normal. You don't realise how much noise community makes until it's gone, but you're still here, walking, breathing, thinking, maybe even hoping. So you keep going. You don't talk much anymore. Not because you've gone mute or anything, but because, well, who's left to talk to? Most people you pass on the road give you that hollow-eyed look, like they're still waking up inside. Some mumble a blessing, others just nod. And plenty pretend they didn't see you at all. There's a weird etiquette to surviving, like an unspoken rule that no one wants to ask too many questions about where you've been or who you lost. You don't ask, they don't ask. Everyone's walking around with half a life. What's even stranger are the tiny new customs popping up everywhere. People won't shake hands anymore. Too risky. Instead, they do this little elbow bow, or sometimes just hold up a dried herb like a weird medieval peace sign. You catch a guy in a fur hat walking backwards through a village because someone told him the plague couldn't follow you that way. Logical? No. But these days, logic's kind of optional. You see entire families wearing necklaces made of garlic, sage, or lavender. Pungent, wilted wreaths meant to ward off bad air. The belief in miasma, or poisonous vapour, is still thick in the air, literally and metaphorically. People stuff pomanders into their sleeves or belts. You've started doing it too, if only because it makes you smell slightly less like a forest animal. And speaking of smell, it's bad out here. Let's not sugarcoat it. Death has a long shelf life, and even if the bodies were buried, the memory lingers. Buildings are musty, fields sour, and nothing quite smells like it used to. You used to think of bread as warm and earthy. Now everything smells faintly like spoiled broth and old shoes, even when it's fresh. But it's not all gross and ghostly. There are moments that feel downright bizarre. One day, you stumble across a band of flagellants in a market square. About 50 people marching in single file, whipping themselves with knotted cords. Their backs are bleeding, they're chanting in Latin, and they're absolutely convinced that all this suffering is divine punishment and self-harm is the only redemption. No one stops them. Some people join. Others toss coins or scraps of bread like it's some kind of roadside performance art. The flagellants aren't new, but they've gotten bolder. Before the plague, they were fringe weirdos. Now, they're the main event in some towns. Local priests are nervous. The Pope's not thrilled, especially since these guys don't really follow church rules. They're kind of DIY theology. But desperate times, desperate chants. You watch them go, their rhythm weirdly hypnotic, and realise that for some folks, this is the only way they've figured out how to process grief. If the world broke, maybe the body has to break too. You decide not to join, but you watch until they disappear down the road, their voices fading into something between a prayer and a wail. Religion in general is evolving, let's say. Some people cling harder than ever, while others just kind of stop showing up at church altogether. Can you blame them? The church promised comfort, healing, maybe even protection. Instead, everyone died. Even the clergy weren't spared. Entire monasteries emptied. And when the priests were gone, people started improvising. In some areas, saints start multiplying. Local legends pop up faster than you can keep track of. St. Elfrida of the coughless sleep, St. Balthus of the untouched children, St. Marmaduke of the cleansed rats. Totally unofficial, but wildly popular. People pray to anyone who sounds like they might pick up. You see a shrine built entirely out of broken cooking pots and burned shoes. You ask someone what it's for and they just say, "So we don't forget." Okay, fair. There's also a rising tide of what can only be described as supernatural overcompensation. People hang bells on their doors to scare away spirits. Talismans carved from bone or driftwood become trendy. You even meet a woman who insists her goose speaks to angels. You don't argue. And then there's the real kicker. No one's quite sure what year it is. Records are scrambled, scribes are gone, and calendars kind of fell apart. Was it 1349? 1351? Depends who you ask. Some people started their own timelines, counting the years since the Great Dying, or using weird seasonal markers like the winter the river froze solid or the spring of the seven-headed calf. Honestly, you kind of enjoy the chaos. Time was always an illusion anyway. But that's not to say it's all madness and mysticism. Slowly, painfully, a new kind of normal begins to creep in. People start rebuilding, not in grand architectural feats, but in tiny practical ways. Someone fixes a well, someone else plants beans, and just like that, life tips forward. Still, there's an edge to everything. People are touchier, quicker to anger, and oddly superstitious. One man accuses his neighbour of stealing death away from his family. Another swears he saw a demon pass through his chicken coop. You learn to steer clear of folks who mutter too much. A little madness is contagious, but not all quirks are sinister. A rather charming side effect of the post-plague funk is that people get weirdly sentimental. Songs that no one sang in years are suddenly popular again. Children, when you finally see them, play games like Ring Around the Rosie, yes that one, and no one seems to know it's about the plague. Or maybe they do, and that's why they sing it. You stop in a village where people tie coloured cloths to a tree, each one a wish or a name of someone lost. You add your own, though you don't write anything on it. You don't need to. The fabric flutters in the breeze like a prayer that doesn't require words. For a brief strange moment you find yourself smiling. It's not happiness exactly, more like recognition. You're not the only one trying to make sense of this half-broken world, and maybe that's enough for now. Here's a fun scholarly debate to close on. Was the post-plague weirdness a temporary psychological response or the beginning of a long cultural shift? Did all the odd rituals, wild beliefs and makeshift saints fade away? Or did they quietly feed into later movements like mysticism, Protestant reform and folk traditions? Honestly. The line between trauma and culture is thin. Paper thin. You're living proof of that. So you keep walking, keep noticing, keep surviving. Even if no one quite knows what day it is. You wake up one morning and realise something strange. People care if you show up to work, not just politely care. Desperately, anxiously, butter you up with free eggs kind of care. It's a good feeling, in a confusing way. Because before the plague, you were just another pair of hands in a long line of bent backs and muddy boots. Now your hands are valuable, maybe even powerful. It turns out that when half the population disappears, those left behind suddenly matter a lot more. There are too few bakers, not enough cobblers. And let's not even talk about the shortage of people who know how to clean out a pigsty without fainting. Landowners, once so smug and certain, are sweating. Fields are empty. Mills sit idle. Harvests fail, not from disease but from plain old neglect. There's no one left to do the work. And so, something quietly radical begins. The workers start negotiating. It begins with simple refusals. A shepherd walks off a noble's estate and doesn't come back. A young woman turns down a job in one village and strolls to another where they offer her a whole chicken and a silver coin. People who were once bound to the land by custom, fear or generational poverty are now suddenly mobile. You can say no. You can walk away. You can brace yourself. Ask for more. This new leverage doesn't go over well with the upper crust. The nobility, used to cheap labour and unquestioning peasants, start having quiet meltdowns. These commoners are getting ideas, they mutter over wine. You overhear one lord whisper to another that his scullery maid demanded shoes with leather soles. The scandal! Laws start popping up, fast and panicked. In England, the government throws together something called the Statute of Labourers in 1351. It tries to force wages back to pre-plague levels and makes it illegal for workers to move around hunting better deals. Essentially, stop acting like you have rights. Spoiler, it doesn't work. Because how do you put the toothpaste back in the tube, or the peasant back in the mud? You meet a young Thatcher who tells you proudly that he turned down 3 job offers in 1 week. They offered me a goose, he says, but I held out for a goat. You nod, impressed. In a world still wobbling from catastrophe, this counts as upward mobility. Of course, with all this chaos comes confusion. People who never expected to own land suddenly do because the owner died with no heir. Property lines blur. A cousin 3 counties away claims he's now the rightful tenant. Paperwork. Good luck finding any. Sometimes the local church steps in to mediate. Sometimes it's settled by a fistfight and a roast chicken wager. And here's your quirky fact for the night. In several regions, Entire villages were up for grabs. If enough of the population died or fled, the land just sat there. People would literally move in and declare themselves the new inhabitants, renaming the place and everything. Imagine showing up to an abandoned hamlet, planting a flag and saying, "This is now called Bobville. I'm Bob." Things get weirdly entrepreneurial. You pass through towns where former serfs have set up their own little trade networks. That guy who used to clean horse stalls, he's now organising wool shipments to Bruges. The widow who lost her whole family, she's selling pastries out of what used to be a grain barn, and they are phenomenal. There's a kind of rough hope forming, patchy and uneven, but real. But of course, not everyone's thriving. Some people hoard land like it's gold. Others go full panic mode, doubling down on old traditions to keep the social pyramid from crumbling. You hear stories of nobles forcing peasants back to work at sword point. Some try to revive the old feudal contracts. "You owe me," they insist. "Your father ploughed my land, and so will you." You? You're not so sure. The world looks different now. Contracts feel like dust. You've seen too much, lost too much, to pretend that things are the same. There's a debate brewing under all this. A slow bubbling academic whisper. Did the plague cause the end of serfdom in Europe, or was it already dying? Some historians say it just sped things up. Others think it gave peasants the first real taste of economic autonomy. Either way, you can feel the tectonic shift under your feet. And just when you think things are settling, the church decides to stick its hand in. Bishops start preaching against greedy workers and sinful ambition. They tell the nobles to hold the line. One particularly cranky friar says the plague was God's punishment for pride, and raising your wages is just tempting him again. You resist the urge to throw a turnip at him. But here's the thing, people are done being quiet. Peasants start writing, like literally writing things down. Open letters, complaints, demands. The idea of a social contract isn't new, but now it's personal. You meet a young man who spent 3 winters learning to read just so he could understand land deeds. He teaches you how to write your name with charcoal on a piece of bark. It's messy, but you feel powerful. Labour is no longer invisible. It's loud, it's mobile, it's valuable. And so, the world wobbles forward. Not perfectly, not evenly. Some places cling to the old ways for another century. Others leap ahead like a child on a sugar high. You're somewhere in the middle, watching the pieces move, trying to decide if you're part of a revolution, or just riding the wave. Either way, it feels good to matter. It's been a while since you've seen a lord riding past with banners and a dozen armoured men in tow. They used to be everywhere, strutting through villages like overdressed peacocks, collecting taxes with one hand and blessing babies with the other. Now they're holed up in their crumbling manors, staring at empty ledgers and wondering why no one wants to plough their fields for free anymore. But you do see something else. Land. Just sitting there, waiting, and no one to claim it. You hike past fields waist-high with thistles, once perfectly cultivated for barley or beans. There's an old mill house beside the river where the wheels stop turning, and you poke your head inside, mouldy flour, broken bags, a rat that stares at you like he owns the place now. You kind of respect him. You find abandoned cottages tucked into groves, some still with furniture intact, a kettle on the hearth, blankets folded neatly, like people meant to come back but never did. And here's the wild thing, you can move in, just pick a spot and stay. No paperwork, no permission. It's not technically legal, but also, who's going to stop you? Squatters become settlers. Strangers become neighbours. You meet a couple who turned a plague-vacant house into a bakery, and they're doing just fine, thank you. She makes bread, he keeps bees, and they've renamed the place Second Chance Hollow. A little dramatic, but you let it slide because their honey is amazing. This kind of land redistribution doesn't happen officially, at least not yet, but unofficially, it's the most widespread real estate shuffle in European history. People just claim what's left. Entire families move into vacant manors. Some poor souls try to restore them to their former grandeur, polishing tapestries, lighting chandeliers, until they realise heating one of those stone beasts in winter is a personal hell. Here's a fun fact. In places like France and England, hundreds of villages disappear entirely during this period. They're known today as lost villages. Archaeologists stumble upon their remnants centuries later. Stone foundations, tools, sometimes even half-dug graves, like postcards from a civilization that just evaporated. And this triggers a bigger shift. one you feel more than understand. The idea of who owns land starts to unravel. Before, it was passed down through noble bloodlines tangled in titles and feudal loyalty. Now, it's often claimed by whoever's left standing. That's unsettling for the aristocracy. They keep sending out messengers and scribes, trying to reassert control, but it's hard to enforce a title when your vassals have either died or moved on to better farmland. You overhear a conversation between two former tenants, now co-owners of what used to be a noble's vineyard. One says, "It's not stealing if there's no one left to own it." The other shrugs and replies, "It's not owning if you didn't survive." Philosophical and practical. You like these people. But the legal messiness doesn't stop at squatting. Heirs start crawling out of the woodwork. Some legitimate, some creatively imagined. You meet a man who claims to be the fifth cousin of a dead baron, armed with a half-burned letter and a lot of confidence. You're not sure if he's a fraud or just optimistic. This land scramble also creates a new type of person, the mobile labourer with options. You're not tied down anymore. You stay where the land is good, the people tolerable, and the food doesn't taste like moss and regret. And when it isn't, you leave. Here's where things get spicy. Local lords and city councils start offering incentives for people like you to settle down. Free land, lower taxes, sometimes even seed to plant or a cow to get you started. Town charters get rewritten to attract newcomers. Suddenly you're being courted like a prize fighter, if prize fighters used hose and occasionally knew Latin. But there's an odd side effect. With all this free-moving, land-claiming, deal-making energy, social structures start to warp. In some areas, you get this weird hybrid class. Not quite peasants, not quite nobility. Let's call them accidental gentry. People who now own land, manage labour, maybe even dress fancy, but still muck stalls on weekends. And that's where you land, metaphorically and literally, somewhere in between. You've got a cottage now, a plot of beans, a chicken that hates you for reasons unclear. You're not rich, but you're not scraping by either. You know how to build a fence, mend a tunic, and you've even figured out how to dig a privy that doesn't flood in the rain. Modern problems, ancient solutions. Here's your scholarly debate for the night. Did this post-plague land shift permanently reshape property rights in Europe? Some argue yes, it helped break feudal monopolies and open the door for more individual land ownership. Others say it was temporary chaos, and by the 1400s the nobles just gobbled up what was left. You can't decide, but you do know one thing. You're not giving up your plot without a fight. Quirky fact time. In certain areas of Italy and southern France, land was inherited matrilineally after the plague, simply because more women survived than men. For a brief moment, a lot of property and power passed through daughters instead of sons. The world didn't end. It just got slightly more interesting. So, here you are. A squatter farmer part-time philosopher with a chicken problem and a future you didn't expect. The landscape is dotted with second chances and you've taken one for yourself. You look at your little patch of earth, breathe in the loamy scent of almost ready potatoes and think, not bad for the end of the world. You wake up to the sound of someone yelling. Not in fear or grief like it used to be. This one's got energy, bite, purpose. You roll out of your straw bed, rub your eyes, and lean out the window of your borrowed cottage. Down by the village square, a small crowd is forming. Someone's shouting about wages, taxes, and how they're not going to take it anymore. You grab your boots and go see what the fuss is about. Turns out the peasants are getting sassy. It starts small, grumbling in the taverns, muttering during mass, complaints passed over fence posts. But it builds. People are tired of being pushed back into old roles. You hear it again and again. We worked through the worst of it. We buried the dead. We held the fields. And now they want us to go back to being invisible? Spoiler. You and everyone else are not feeling invisible anymore. It's a strange feeling, watching people who used to bow their heads now standing tall, arms crossed, refusing to kneel. Before the plague, a peasant talking back to a lord was almost laughable. Now, it's common enough that lords are riding around with guards again, just in case the locals get ideas. And oh, they are getting ideas. In England, word starts to spread of attacks, another one. The third or fourth since the plague, depending on how you count. But this one hits different. People are already stretched thin, and the memory of mass graves and screaming cart drivers is still fresh. The idea of giving more to the very people who let them rot during the worst of it? Yeah, that doesn't land well. It all reaches a boiling point in 1381. Maybe you're there, maybe you just hear the stories from passing merchants, but either way, It's loud, and it's real. Wat Tyler, a name that sounds more like a local woodcutter than a rebel leader, rises out of the crowd, alongside a priest named John Ball, who basically preaches that all men were made equal, which is definitely not church approved. He leads thousands of peasants to London, with pitchforks and swords and some very strong opinions. When Adam delved and Eve span, Ball says, "Who then was the gentleman?" That line, it sticks. You hear it repeated in every tavern from Kent to Yorkshire. It's not just rebellion, it's a philosophy, a burning question. If death doesn't care about class, why should the living? The revolt doesn't end well. Tyler is killed during negotiations. The king, young and nervous, promises reforms and then promptly walks it all back. But the damage is done. Not to the monarchy, not even to the tax system, but to the illusion that peasants can't push back. The glass wall between nobles and everyone else, cracked, and England isn't alone. Across Europe, similar uprisings spark like dry grass catching flame. In France, there's the Jacquerie in 1358, named after Jacques, the go-to name for your average French peasant. These guys get fed up with marauding soldiers, high taxes, and nobles retreating to fortified castles, while everyone else starves. So they rise up. It's short, brutal, and suppressed with terrifying force. But again, the memory lingers. People remember, and they keep talking. Even in Italy, uprisings break out. In Florence, the Ciompi Revolt of 1378 sees wool workers, the lowest rung of the labour ladder, take control of the government for a brief, breathless moment. Can you imagine? People with dirt under their nails making laws. It doesn't last, but it sends a message. There's more of us than them. Of course, not everyone is thrilled with this newfound backbone. The elite don't like feeling nervous at the sight of a hoe or a scythe. They start building more walls, literally. You see towns throwing up stone defences again, not for foreign armies, but against their own people. You hear whispers of blacklist, secret church sermons condemning the pride of the lowborn, and quietly reissued laws making it illegal to gather in groups larger than 10 without noble oversight. A group of 11 shepherds talking about wages? That's considered sedition. You can't help but laugh. It's like someone tried to outlaw frustration. One quirky detail sticks with you from this era. In some villages, people start wearing little badges or pins to signal solidarity. Nothing fancy. A carved wooden circle, a coloured ribbon. Just a sign that says, "Hey, I see you. I'm with you." You keep one tucked inside your cloak, though you never show it openly. Still, it feels good, heavy in your pocket. Here's a scholarly debate that still gets historians riled up. Were these peasant revolts early examples of class consciousness, proto-Marxism, if you squint? Or were they more about immediate survival, a flash of fury with no long-term political vision? Hard to say. You've met plenty of people who just want bread and peace. But you've also heard others asking real questions about ownership, inheritance, even governance. Questions with teeth. And then there's the church, which finds itself caught in the crossfire. It used to be the one steady institution, the middleman between kings and peasants. Now, people are sceptical. If the clergy survived in comfort while the laity died in ditches, what does that say? You see priests heckled, monasteries boycotted, and in some places entire congregations just stop showing up. The revolt energy doesn't just vanish after the soldiers come in and stomp it down. It lingers in quiet defiance. And the new way people look at their lords, no longer reverent, just resigned. It lingers in how peasants start demanding written contracts for labour, how they organise harvest schedules as equals, not servants. You even see it in fashion, seriously. Poor folks start dressing better, not noble levels of fancy, but nicer than before. Tunics in brighter colours, belts with a bit of decoration. It's like everyone collectively decided no more grey potato sacks. Let's at least look like we belong to this world. And you? You feel it too. A little straighter in your spine, a little less timid at the marketplace. You've seen what happens when people stand up. It doesn't always end well, sure, but it always means something. And sometimes, meaning is all you've got. So the peasants don't go back to being silent. They keep murmuring, gathering, pushing. And over time, those murmurs will turn into demands, and those demands will shape kingdoms. But for now, you head back to your cottage, pass by your neighbour's goat, still hateful, and light your evening fire. The world is shifting, not in a rush, but like a hilltop after a rainstorm, slow, cracking, unstoppable, and you're standing right in the middle of it, It's getting harder to ignore them. The drums, the chanting, the rhythmic slap of bloodied ropes against human backs. Yeah, the flagellants are back in town. Again. You're on your way to trade onions for a new pair of boots, and there they are, parading straight down the main road like medieval flash mob performance artists. Except instead of interpretive dance, it's self-harm and apocalyptic monologues. They come in barefoot, shirtless, and smeared with dirt. Some wear white robes with red crosses, others look like they haven't changed clothes since the plague first hit. They carry banners, sing haunting hymns, and whip themselves in synchronized arcs. Each strike a sharp reminder that religion can get very theatrical when people feel helpless. And honestly, you kind of get it. They're not just out here for the spectacle. The world went sideways, and these folks are just trying to make sense of it the only way they know how, by blaming sin and beating it out of themselves. They believe the plague was God's punishment for humanity's wickedness, and now they're offering their pain as a sacrifice. It's part repentance, part performance, part group therapy. Very loud group therapy. You spot a few villagers watching them from behind doorways, eyes wide and unmoving. Others kneel as the procession passes, not out of piety, but maybe a quiet hope that the spectacle might somehow help, that maybe all this pain will appease whatever cosmic force keeps turning everything into a dumpster fire. Of course, not everyone's buying it. The local priest peeks out from his chapel window, looking about ready to fake an illness just to avoid confrontation. The flagellants aren't exactly popular with church leadership. They act outside the church's control, they preach their own sermons, and they attract huge crowds. That makes them dangerous, and not just to themselves. You overhear one of the robed men shouting something about the Pope being a fraud, the end times being near, and the earth bleeding through its skin. It's all very dramatic, but it lands differently now that people are traumatized, confused, and trying to rebuild. Fear listens more carefully after a crisis. This movement started during the height of the plague, but it didn't die with it. In fact, in many places the flagellants are more visible after the plague, like weeds that grew up in the cracks of a broken system. They wander from town to town like doomsday troubadours, collecting followers and freaking out local officials. It's kind of like a roadshow panic tour. In Strasbourg they caused actual riots. In Erfurt they were banned. In places like Switzerland and Austria, entire towns turned out to either cheer them on or yell at them to leave. You've seen both, depending on the weather and general mood. Quirky fact for you tonight: some flagellants travelled with their own musicians. Drummers, pipers, even singers to accompany the lashings. Think about that. Someone's job was to provide the soundtrack to public self-flagellation. Imagine applying for that gig. But here's where things get complicated. These folks don't just chant and bleed and move on. They leave behind ideas, new ones, heretical ones, powerful ones. They preach that you don't need priests to reach God, that penance is between you and the heavens, that the church failed during the plague, so maybe it isn't the only voice of truth anymore. Sound familiar? It should. These seeds will eventually bloom into the full-blown religious upheavals of later centuries. Protestantism doesn't come out of nowhere. It's watered by fear, confusion, and grassroots movements like this. Right now, though, the church isn't having it. By the mid-1300s, the Pope, safely tucked away in Avignon, officially condemns the flagellants, bans their processions, excommunicates leaders. But excommunication means little when the world already feels cursed, so they keep marching, dodging authority like a bunch of barefoot outlaws. You ask one of them why he does it. He looks at you with tearful eyes, lifts his shirt to reveal a mess of scars and says, "So you don't have to?" Which is both deeply moving and completely terrifying. You give him a nod and maybe a bit of cheese, then quietly walk away. There's another layer to this, one you start to notice the more you travel. The flagellants are mostly men, and often they're younger, rootless, and angry. With so many families broken, so many communities scattered, young men without homes or futures flock to something, anything, that gives them purpose. Pain becomes identity. Brotherhood becomes belief. But not all expressions of faith go full blood and guilt. In other parts of Europe, people respond to the same crisis by building little chapels, carving new icons, or writing mystical poetry. You meet an old woman outside Lübeck who's convinced she saw the Virgin Mary in a fog bank and now hosts nightly prayer circles in her barn. The barn smells like cows, but also like hope, so you go with it. There's a growing tension, though, a spiritual tug-of-war between centralised authority and grassroots devotion. You feel it. On one side, the church trying to reassert order, clamp down on dissent, and rebuild its image. On the other, a restless, hurting population, experimenting with faith like it's wet clay, shaping it into whatever they need. Here's a scholarly debate to lull you further into a half-dream state. Were the flagellants just a fringe reaction to trauma, or were they an early form of popular resistance against ecclesiastical authority? Some argue they were proto-reformers. Others think they were more like spiritual shock absorbers, channeling fear into performance to prevent actual revolt. Either way, you're living through a time when pain becomes public, faith becomes flexible, and belief becomes deeply personal. You walk back from town that night under a swollen moon, still hearing the echo of chanting in your ears. You pass by the village shrine, a new one carved from salvaged church pews, and light a candle without even thinking. No priest, no choir, just you and the flicker of light against the darkness. The flagellants may pass, but the questions they raise linger like smoke. Who holds truth? Who owns redemption? And what does faith look like when the world has already ended once? You don't have answers. No one really does. But at least you're not alone in asking. The church bells still ring, barely. Just once or twice a day now, and only if someone remembered to pull the rope. You've noticed they sound different lately, more hollow somehow, like the towers themselves are tired. Or maybe it's you. It's hard to tell anymore. Either way, religion doesn't feel quite as solid as it used to. You remember a time, not that long ago, when the church was the unquestioned authority in everything. Life, death, taxes, marriage, your eternal soul. Yep. All run through the local priest with his ink-stained fingers and that one gold ring he always kissed before prayers. Back then, salvation came in a package. Weekly mass, alms for the poor, maybe a pilgrimage if you were feeling extra holy. You followed the steps, and in return, you were promised answers. But now the answers feel fuzzy. The plague didn't just kill people, it exposed cracks, deep, ugly ones. The kind of cracks that were always there, but you only noticed once everything else fell apart. People saw priests fleeing towns before the dying even started. Monks locking their doors, bishops hoarding food while entire villages starved. And then, worst of all, the plague came anyway. All the prayers, all the indulgences, all the holy relics, none of it stopped the bleeding. So faith is still here, but it's shifting. Quietly, awkwardly, like a man trying to sit on a chair that might not be there. You pass by a church one morning and notice it's half empty during service. The priest drones on about obedience and humility, but most people are just staring at the floor. A few whisper to each other. One old woman straight up falls asleep, which would have been scandalous a few years ago. Now it's just Tuesday. But the weirdest part is this. The void left behind by the fading authority of the church. It's not empty. It's being filled. Not all at once, and not in any organised way, but still, filled. You see little signs of it everywhere. Shrines sprouting up outside town boundaries. People wearing amulets that aren't quite Christian, but not exactly pagan either. Prayer circles happening in barns and fields, and once, weirdly, in a blacksmith shop. It smells like hot iron and burnt feathers, and no one's entirely sure what they're praying for, but they keep showing up. Mysticism is having a moment. Visions, revelations, dreams. You can't go 2 miles without someone claiming they've been spoken to by a saint, an angel, or the Virgin Mary herself. Some of these people are clearly touched in the head. Others? Honestly, they sound convincing. There's one woman you meet on the road to Cologne. Young, pale, barefoot. She says she walks only where God guides her. She's made it across 3 countries on faith alone and a suspicious amount of foraged berries. You talk with her for a while, and she tells you things you haven't heard in sermons. That God is everywhere, not just in buildings. That suffering isn't punishment but transformation. That salvation is personal, not purchased. Then she hands you a small stone with a cross carved into it, and walks on like you're just another step in her journey, and you carry that stone for weeks. Not because you believe in it, yet, but because something about it feels true. Or close enough. You also hear whispers about new saints, ones not approved by the Vatican. Local ones. People who died during the plague while caring for others, or who survived miraculously and now wander, healing and blessing and muttering half-lost psalms. They don't wear mitres or carry staffs. Most don't even know Latin, but they've got crowds. One guy, people call him Brother Eli, shows up outside Bruges wearing nothing but a wool tunic and a crown made of grapevine. He gives long, strange sermons about how the world must shed its skin like a snake before it can heal. You don't understand half of it, but everyone listens. Really listens. Then he takes off his crown and gives it to a beggar, who cries for 10 solid minutes. Not all of it is peaceful. As the church struggles to reassert control, tensions rise. Clergy begin publicly condemning unauthorized gatherings. In some places, authorities arrest wandering preachers, accusing them of heresy. You watch one man get dragged from a crowd, still shouting scripture as the guards carry him off. It's chilling, but also weirdly inspiring. There's an argument bubbling under all of this, one the scholars still wrestle with. Was this post-plague religious messiness the early spark of the Reformation? Some say absolutely it weakened the church's monopoly on salvation. Others say it was just a necessary cultural detox after collective trauma, like spiritual freeform jazz before the institutions re-solidified. But here's the fringe fact you weren't expecting. In certain regions, people start incorporating astrology into religious practice. Yep, stars, planets, lunar cycles, all used to explain God's will. Some folks believe the plague was written in the sky long before it arrived, and now they look to the heavens for updates. One baker in Bavaria tells you Mercury is in retrograde and that's why his bread won't rise. You nod solemnly and eat it anyway. Meanwhile, the church tries a rebrand. More saints, more relics, more processions. You attend one in Prague that's so elaborate it feels like a parade for holy bones. They carry a skull wrapped in gold, claim it belonged to some martyr no one's heard of, and the crowd goes nuts. People toss flowers, children weep. It's all very dramatic and very effective for a while. But deep down, people are still asking the big questions. Why did so many die? Why didn't the priests know what to do? Why didn't God stop it? No one has answers, only variations, and some of them are beautiful. You light a candle at one of those roadside shrines one night. Just a tiny flame in the dark next to dozens of others. You don't say a prayer because you don't know what to ask for. But standing there in the flickering silence, you realise that maybe prayer isn't about asking. Maybe it's just about not being alone. The first time you see it, you think it's a mistake. A painting, on wood, not canvas, leaning against the wall of a small chapel outside Siena. You stop mid-step, your bread nearly slipping from your satchel, because the image doesn't look like the saints and angels you're used to. No glowing halos, no gently folded hands. Instead, it's skeletons. Dozens of them. Dancing. They twist and leap with eerie joy, arms linked with nobles and peasants alike. A bishop spins beside a beggar. A queen twirls with a corpse in a tattered shroud. You squint at the inscription beneath and read something like, "As we are, so shall you be." Cheerful stuff. But it's not a joke. These kinds of images, memento mori, remember you must die, are showing up everywhere now. Painted on church walls, carved into wooden beams, even stitched into funeral robes. Death is no longer hiding behind a veil or tucked into the corner of a fresco. It's front and centre, posing, grinning. It's not morbid, though. Not really. It's just honest. The plague changed art forever. Before, most religious art was predictable, heavenly, ordered, glowy. Jesus looked peaceful. Mary looked serene. Even martyrdom had a certain beauty to it, like suffering was just a brief inconvenience before celestial rewards. Now, everything's raw, emotional, weird. You visit a chapel in Lübeck and find a mural showing the Last Judgment, but this time, the damned look exactly like your neighbours. One even seems to be holding a chicken. There's fire, screaming, angels wielding swords like they mean it. You turn to leave and realise the doorframe is carved with tiny skulls. Just a little reminder to think about mortality on your way out. Artists are different now too. Bolder, grittier. They're painting what they've seen, mass graves, grieving mothers, bone pickers walking the fields. You meet one in Florence who insists he only uses ash in his pigments now. He says it gives the colours life. You nod. Mostly because he looks like he hasn't slept in 3 days and you don't want to argue with a man who paints with charred remains. Even saints are getting a makeover. They look more human, more tired, less like divine fashion models and more like people who've seen some stuff. There's a painting of St. Sebastian riddled with arrows, and instead of looking vaguely annoyed, he actually looks like he's in pain. It's startling, and kind of refreshing. This shift isn't just visual, it's emotional. Art becomes a form of coping, a kind of cultural group therapy session, where everyone throws their grief, fear and confusion onto the wall and says, "There, that's how it felt." The dance of death isn't there to scare you. It's a weird kind of solidarity. Rich, poor, pious, sinful. We all end up bones, and yet there's something freeing about that, equalizing. You hear people joke about it in a not really joking way. We're all skeletons underneath anyway, a merchant laughs over wine. Might as well dance before the worms do. You clink cups and try not to think about worms. A quirky little moment. In Paris, someone starts selling playing cards with skeletons in different roles. King Death, Knight Death, even Fool Death. It catches on fast. Before long, half the taverns you pass are filled with people playing Bones and Thrones like it's a national sport. Morbid, yes, but also kind of fun. Theatre changes too. Performances go darker. Morality plays become popular. Little dramas where personified virtues and sins fight over the soul of an everyman character. Greed is played by a man with coins glued to his face. Mercy wears a cloak of white linen and cries on command. The audiences love it, especially when death appears in the final act, dragging the hero away no matter what he chose. Not a subtle metaphor. You start to realise that post-play culture isn't obsessed with death so much as redefining it. Before, death was an event that happened at the edge of life. Now it's woven into daily existence. People keep skull charms on necklaces. Some wear black even outside mourning periods. You meet a woman who embroiders tiny coffins into the hem of her apron. Just to keep perspective, she says with a shrug. Here's where the scholarly debate creeps in. Was this explosion of macabre art and symbolism a sign of mass trauma? Or was it just people being practical? Did the plague warp European aesthetics? Or did it finally rip off the polite mask that was hiding the truth all along? You've got your own theory. Maybe it's both. Maybe when the world breaks, you stop pretending it was ever tidy to begin with. Maybe the skeletons were always dancing. We just finally opened our eyes. You see it in children's drawings too. Charcoal scribbles of hooded figures, grinning skulls with flowers, people holding hands with angels. One child draws a picture of his family as ghosts, floating above a house that looks suspiciously like yours. He smiles when he shows it to you. You try to smile back, but it's not all death and dread. New forms of beauty emerge too. There's a kind of soft melancholy to the music now, more minor keys, more aching melodies. People sing songs that sound like lullabies and eulogies at once. You hear one in a market, a tune about a lover who died in spring and returned as a swallow. It stays in your head for weeks. And the art that isn't about death? It's about survival, about quiet moments. A mother brushing a child's hair, a man feeding geese in the snow, a woman lighting a lantern with no one else around. These images feel just as powerful as the skeletons because they whisper, "See? We're still here." One more odd fact for your bedtime collection. Tomb sculptures start changing. Instead of idealised images of the dead in youth or prayer, people start commissioning transy effigies, stone carvings of their own decaying bodies, bones, worms, sagging skin, literal death masks. It's both horrifying and incredibly honest. One nobleman apparently requested he be shown as he will be 1 year after burial. Bold choice. But there's beauty in that too. A kind of dignity in refusing to lie about where this all ends, and maybe strangely a comfort. So tonight, as you lie down on your straw-stuffed mattress and stare at the shadows on your wall, you think about those dancing skeletons, not as a threat but a reminder that you're part of the dance too, still moving, still breathing, still here, and maybe that's the most beautiful thing of all. You used to avoid graveyards. Most people did. They were quiet places for funerals, not for lingering. But now they've become oddly social. People walk through them in the evenings like parks. They sit on mossy stones, light candles, even leave letters. It's not morbid, it's therapeutic. In a world where half the population vanished, people are finding new ways to live with death instead of hiding from it. It's not about fear anymore, it's about remembering and planning. Death is trendy now, in the strangest possible way. Not in a depressing woe is me sense, but in a very practical, mildly theatrical kind of way. You know people who are planning their funerals with more flair than a royal wedding. A neighbour insists her coffin must be carved from oak and lined with blue wool. Another has commissioned an original song to be sung by local children, minor key only of course, for proper drama. You get invited to a pre-morning gathering. It's like a funeral rehearsal. The guest of honour is still alive, sipping cider in a fur-trimmed cloak while everyone shares what they'll say when she's gone. She claps, she cries, she critiques. "A little more feeling, please," she tells one nephew who flubs his tribute. Honestly, it's kind of brilliant. The way people think about dying has changed entirely. Before the plague, it was something that happened out of sight, handled by priests and family, kept under the surface like a bad smell. Now, it's part of dinner conversation. People talk openly about where they want to be buried, what they want to wear, whether they'd prefer to go in their sleep or in the middle of a dramatic rainstorm. One man says he wants to die mid-sentence while telling a joke. You respect that. And it's not just the wealthy making these plans. Poor folks are doing it too. They may not afford silk-lined coffins, but they carve their own markers or pick a special rock to serve as a headstone. Some start building their graves in advance. Little plots marked with their name and a short phrase like, "not yet," or "soonish." It's dark humour, sure, but it's also control. A way to say, I've seen what death can do. I'm not scared of it anymore. I'm ready when I'm ready. Here's a quirky little tradition you stumble upon. The Ars Moriendi, the art of dying. It's a set of guides being copied and passed around, especially among the middle class. Illustrated books that tell you how to die well. Literally, how to confess, how to say goodbye, how to accept your fate with grace and minimal drama, or maximum drama if that's your style. Some versions even include little woodcut comics showing the dying man resisting demons at his bedside. It's like a spiritual instruction manual meets a medieval graphic novel, and you know what? People actually read them. In a time where half the world feels like it's just barely holding together, having a script for the end brings a strange kind of peace. But not everyone wants peace. Some want legacy. You start to notice an uptick in tombs, not just graves, but full-on statements, marble slabs, stained glass panels, carvings that show the deceased looking noble and serene, sometimes even mid-prayer, as if they just paused for eternity. In towns like Florence and Avignon, there are tombs so big you could live in them. Some people probably do. One merchant commissions a statue of himself handing a coin to a beggar, just so everyone knows he was generous. Another has himself carved lying peacefully, with angels lifting his soul skyward like a medieval balloon ride. There's vanity here, sure, but also vulnerability. These people want to be remembered for something, anything. A scholarly debate you'll enjoy. Was this obsession with death just trauma on display, or was it a new form of identity building? Did the plague trigger a wave of ego, or did it make people more self-aware? Some argue that pre-plague life was too structured, people born into roles living by custom. After the plague, suddenly you could shape how you were remembered, not just as a farmer or wife, but as you. There's even a quiet gender shift in all of this. Women start appearing more often in memorial art, not just as grieving widows or anonymous saints, but as thinkers, healers, mothers, workers. Some are shown reading, or holding tools, or sitting on thrones beside their husbands. It's subtle, but it's new. And you get the sense that slowly, the way people understand life and its end is changing for everyone, not just the privileged few. One evening, you visit a town that holds monthly death dinners. Everyone brings a dish and a story, usually about someone they lost. Sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's tragic. There's wine, bread, and a lot of weepy laughter. It's not sad, not really. It's human. Deeply, honestly human. You stay late, long after the candles burn low, listening to an old woman talk about her husband. She describes his laugh, the way he peeled onions with his eyes closed, how he always forgot the names of their goats. "I don't want to forget," she says, "and I don't want him to be forgotten either." And that's really the core of it, isn't it? In a world where death came so fast and so brutally, people are doing everything they can to slow it down, to give it shape. to make it meaningful, so you find yourself thinking about your own death more than you'd like to admit. Not in a grim way, just practically. Where would you want to rest? Who would remember you? Would anyone light a candle or leave a note or carve something halfway decent into your stone? You haven't picked a spot yet, but you've thought about it. Maybe on a hill, under a tree, somewhere with a good view and a soft wind, somewhere quiet but not too quiet. Somewhere people might still come and sit and laugh and tell stories. Maybe not today, but someday. Because now, death isn't just an ending. It's something you plan for. It's something you prepare. It's something you own. The next time you're sick, you don't panic right away. It's just a fever, a scratchy throat, some chills. You've had worse. You wrap yourself in a blanket, drink a little vinegar water, because someone swore it helps, and wait it out. But a part of you, a deep, quiet part, still clenches. Because even now, a sniffle feels like a prophecy. You survived the plague once, maybe twice, depending on how you count that suspicious spring in Bruges. But the fear doesn't fully leave. That thick, sticky dread that wraps itself around your ribs whenever your body falters. You've seen what illness can do, and more importantly, you've seen what medicine can't. That's the trouble. After the Black Death, people still get sick, all the time. But now they don't pretend to have answers anymore. Doctors, if you can find one, have gone from confident to cautious, less swagger, more sage-scented muttering. They've swapped leeches for licorice, bloodletting for baths. Not because they're sure it works, but because they've run out of better ideas. And yet medicine is starting to shift, just a little. You visit a city with a university, one of the newer ones, and meet a scholar who's studying anatomy using, get this, actual bodies. Not just sheep or pigs or that one time with the poorly preserved arm. Real human corpses. Quietly, of course. The church still has opinions. But people are beginning to admit that understanding the human body might require more than Latin prayers and jars of urine. There's a tension, though, between old and new, between the herbalists with their poultices and charms, and the scholars with their dusty scrolls and increasingly questionable dissections. You go to a healer who waves smoke over your head and tells you your bile is too ambitious. You go to another who says it's all about imbalanced heat and prescribes crushed pearls in wine. You don't know who's right, but the wine helps, so that's something. Doctors still wear those beaked masks in some places. You thought it was just a plague thing, but apparently not. The masks are stuffed with herbs, lavender, mint, rue, and meant to block out the bad air or miasma. You try one on once. It smells like a haunted herb garden and makes you look like a depressed bird, but you can see the appeal. It's protective, symbolic, almost comforting. A wearable illusion of safety. One quirky fact. In certain cities, barber surgeons start doubling as dentists, executioners and bathhouse managers, which means the same guy might pull your tooth, cut your hair, lance your boil, and then go decapitate someone before lunch, multitasking at its finest. But here's where it gets interesting. The people who really start gaining attention aren't the cloaked physicians with royal titles. It's the midwives, the apothecaries, the local wise women. They were always there, quietly doing the work, delivering babies, setting bones, brewing teas that don't taste like regret. But after the plague, their importance becomes undeniable. You visit a village where the most trusted medical mind is a woman named Anselma. No degree, no Latin. Just generations of passed-down knowledge and a killer rosehip tonic. She treats wounds with honey, eases fevers with willow bark, and once made a poultice that supposedly cured a man of melancholy that clung to the spleen. The town reveres her. The priest tolerates her. And you? You keep her name in your back pocket just in case. But with respect comes suspicion. Not everyone is comfortable with healers who don't answer to bishops or universities. Whispered accusations rise. She talks to spirits. She owns too many cats. She cured old Jacob's limp, unnaturally fast. You can see where this is going. Healing and heresy walk a dangerously thin line. That brings you to a creeping fear that starts whispering through Europe in the plague's aftermath. Witchcraft. People are desperate for explanations. Why did some live and others die? Why did this town survive while that one vanished? When answers are scarce, blame is convenient, and often that blame falls on women. Especially the ones with too much knowledge, too much independence, or just a slightly unnerving smile. The church begins codifying what counts as sorcery. You hear murmurs of inquisitions, of trials, not full-scale hysteria, yet, but the groundwork is being laid. You pass through a village where someone was burned for hexing the cattle. The cows looked perfectly fine to you, maybe just moody. There's a scholarly debate smouldering underneath all this. Did the plague catalyse the rise of medical empiricism, or did it push people deeper into superstition? The answer, frustratingly, seems to be both. For every healer experimenting with herbs, there's a priest burying a statue to ward off disease. For every scholar dissecting bodies, there's a town praying over a well to make it holy again. And you? You learn to balance between both worlds. Little sage for the fever, a little prayer just in case. You keep a sprig of rosemary above your door not because it's proven to do anything, but because it makes you feel better. Sometimes that's enough. Hospitals are changing too. Not the grand sterile ones we know today, but modest buildings where the sick are tended with something approaching organisation. Some are run by religious orders, others by cities trying to prevent the next outbreak. They're still more about comfort than cure. But hey, fresh sheets and hot soup go a long way. One night you help carry a fevered boy to the town infirmary. The nurse, an elderly monk with shaky hands, thanks you and offers you a chunk of dried apple. "We're better than we were," he says, eyes tired but kind. "Still don't know what we're doing, but we're trying." And that's really the story of medicine now. Less confident, more curious, still full of wild guesses, but with a growing awareness that maybe, just maybe, the body is a puzzle worth solving, not a punishment to endure. You get better, by the way. The fever passes. Whether it was the herbs or the prayers or the wine, no one can say, but the next time someone sneezes nearby, you still hold your breath, just for a second. It sneaks in quietly, almost as if it's embarrassed to show up right now. The world's still bruised, limping through grief. And suddenly someone starts carving a statue, not of a skeleton or a saint, but of a naked man standing in perfect balance, arms outstretched like he's measuring the world. And for the first time in a long time, people pause not to mourn, but to wonder. They call it Renaissance. You don't know the word yet. It hasn't officially arrived in your vocabulary, but you can feel it. Something is stirring. People are digging up old books, copying ancient texts, quoting long-dead philosophers who had names like Cicero and Galen and didn't know anything about fleas or feudalism. It's like someone pulled back a dusty curtain and remembered that humans can think. You notice it first in Florence. That city hums with a different kind of energy. There's still the usual medieval chaos, muddy roads, questionable meat pies, the odd shouting match between merchants. But now there's art in the corners. Chalk sketches on walls, poetry pinned to trees. A boy reciting verses in Latin while juggling oranges. You blink, and suddenly you're surrounded by colour, movement, and ideas that aren't entirely about doom. You hear talk of a man named Petrarch, someone who wrote letters to dead Romans and claimed it wasn't madness, it was admiration. People laugh, but they also copy him. Suddenly everyone wants to rediscover the wisdom of the ancients. The phrase "back to the sources" gets tossed around like breadcrumbs. Monks start unrolling old scrolls, brushing off the dust and realising, hey, some of this is actually brilliant. Universities become curious again, less obsessed with proving how many angels can dance on a pinhead, and more interested in how the human body actually works. People are reading, not just theology but logic, medicine, architecture, astronomy. You see a young man scribbling notes about how birds fly, and wondering if humans might one day do the same. You don't have the heart to tell him no. That's the quirky thing about this moment in history. It isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself with banners and horns. It shows up in curious questions, in notebooks, in lines of poetry slipped into love letters. It grows slowly in the minds of scholars, artists, and yes, even traders and bakers who suddenly want their children to learn Greek. And art. Oh, art is changing. You pass through a cathedral being repaired and notice something off. One of the stained glass panels doesn't show a saint, it shows a merchant, holding a ledger, kneeling sure but definitely proud. He paid for the window, and now he wants to be in the window. Vanity? Maybe. But also a subtle declaration. I matter. My work matters. More and more portraits begin to show up. Real ones. Not just idealized saints with glowing foreheads, but actual people with crooked noses, wrinkled foreheads, and uncertain smiles. People want to be remembered as they are, not as how they're supposed to look in heaven. One day you stumble across a painting in a small Florentine workshop. A Madonna, yes, but she's warm, real. She has curves, softness, and her eyes follow you, not like judgment, but like understanding. There's a baby on her lap who actually looks like a baby, not a tiny adult. It hits you in the gut. You stand there too long. The artist offers you bread. You accept. You hear names whispered like spells: Giotto, Masaccio, Brunelleschi. Men turning walls into windows to the soul. And women too, though their names don't travel as far. Nuns painting illuminated manuscripts in convents. Poets writing under pen names. Thinkers quietly moving the chess pieces of this new age without fanfare. A scholarly debate begins to simmer. Is this truly a rebirth of classical wisdom, or just a lucky string of wealthy patrons and clever artists riding the wave of post-plague vacancy? Some argue the Renaissance was inevitable. Others say it needed a trauma big enough to shake the dust off Europe's brain. The Black Death, as grim as it was, cleared the table for something else to grow. You meet a merchant who tells you he funds artists now instead of just spice traders. One feeds the body, the other feeds the soul, he says with a grin, chewing almonds like a philosopher. You're not sure which soul he's feeding, but his sculpture garden is impressive, and it's not just art and books. Architecture starts to stretch its limbs. People build with harmony in mind, symmetry, balance, proportion. Churches begin to look less like fortresses and more like invitations. Arches widen, light flows in, everything breathes a little easier. One quirky little Renaissance gem. In Milan, a man invents an early design for a machine to grind lenses. Not for war, for seeing. He dreams of tiny glass circles that can help the aging read longer. You try on a pair, they don't work yet. But you smile anyway. The idea is beautiful. There's danger too, of course. Not everyone likes this new wave of thinking. Some clergy call it arrogance. Humanism, they sneer, as if focusing on human beings is inherently suspicious. And honestly, they're not wrong to worry. Once people start questioning one thing, like whether saints have to be thin and floaty, they start questioning everything. But you don't see rebellion in it. You see curiosity. A quiet, relentless hunger to understand more. To create more. To be more than just survivors. You pass a school one afternoon and hear children reciting lines from Ovid. Badly. One kid picks his nose while another says, metamorphosis, like it's a swear word. But still, you pause and listen. A century ago, that would have been unthinkable. Now, it's just Tuesday. You may not live long enough to see the Renaissance in full bloom. It will take generations to fully unfold. But tonight, you sit beneath a sky that people are beginning to map with accuracy instead of mythology. You hold a book copied by candlelight. You eat food made with thought, not just survival. And for the first time in a long while, you don't think only of death. You think of what comes after. There's a saying you hear tossed around the marketplace in Florence. All roads lead to rivalry. Okay, maybe you made that one up, but the sentiment stands. Because the Renaissance isn't just some peaceful rebirth full of soft lighting and Greek scrolls. It's also a full-blown political soap opera, and you're now living in the messiest, most backstabbing reality show medieval Europe has to offer. The rise of the Italian city-states. You've wandered your way into a world that runs on coin, cunning, and really well-tailored tunics. Florence, Venice, Milan, Genoa, and a handful of others. They're not just cities, they're entities, brimming with wealth, ambition, and so much dramatic tension it might as well come with a soundtrack. Each one wants to be the brightest, richest, smartest, and most destined by God to lead Italy into a glorious future. Sound familiar? Florence, your current home base, is thick with the smell of ink, leather, and barely restrained arrogance. The Medici family is rising, using banking like it's a form of warfare. You've never seen so many coins in one place, and you're not even allowed in the bank. But their money's everywhere, in paintings, in cathedrals, in the poets reciting sonnets in the piazza for tips and prestige. The Medici don't rule officially, of course. Florence is still a republic, but everyone knows who's really pulling the strings. Cosimo de' Medici walks through the square like a man who owns both the scenery and the lighting. And in many ways he does. Milan's different, colder, more steel, less velvet. The Visconti and later the Sforza families dominate there. Less art, more armour. You visit once and it's like walking into a military parade disguised as a city council meeting. People speak in short sentences and stare too long. You don't stay. Venice, on the other hand, feels like a fever dream. It floats, literally, on water and ambition. The Doge wears a hat that looks like a pastry and lives in a palace that glitters like a jewellery box. Everything smells like sea salt and incense. The markets sell spices you can't pronounce, and you once saw a man buy a peacock just because it matched his coat. You're not sure Venice is real. Each city-state is its own kingdom in all but name, and they're constantly scheming against one another. Treaties are made, broken, rewritten, and rebroken. Alliances shift like the wind. One week Florence and Milan are friends. The next, they're hiring mercenaries to burn each other's crops. Everyone's paranoid. Everyone spies on everyone. You deliver a letter once that turns out to be code. You have no idea what it said, but the recipient gave you a chicken, so... success? Here's a quirky fact. The rise of city-states also births an entire industry of professional letter writers, messengers and forgers. It's the golden age of passive-aggressive correspondence. You meet one man whose full-time job is to write flattering letters for people too nervous to do it themselves. Never underestimate a well-placed compliment, he tells you, dipping his quill dramatically, especially if it's in Latin. And it's not just politics and poison. This fierce competition spills over into art, architecture and science. If Florence builds a cathedral dome, Milan has to build a taller one. If Venice commissions a painting of the Madonna, Genoa wants two, and theirs had better have more gold leaf. Even funerals become events. You watch one procession where the deceased's coffin is carried by 12 men dressed as apostle, followed by a choir of orphans singing an original hymn. The crowd claps. You join in, slightly confused. This rivalry isn't purely shallow, though. It fuels progress. Artists and thinkers bounce from city to city, following the money and the commissions. An architect might sketch in Bologna in the morning, then hop a mule to Padua for an evening lecture. Everyone wants talent. Everyone wants legacy. Scholarly debate time. Did the intense competition between city-states accelerate the Renaissance, or did it just make everything more chaotic? Some say the wealth and rivalry created the perfect storm for cultural explosion. Others argue it fragmented Italy, delaying unification for centuries. You don't know. But watching sculptors duel with marble and poets insult each other in rhyming couplets, highly entertaining. But there's a darker undercurrent too. The beauty and brilliance you see on the surface, it's paid for with exploitation. Guilds crack down hard on outsiders. Taxes hit the poor harder than anyone admits. And while the rich commission palaces, the sick still die in back alleys. You once help a sick girl find her way to a public hospital, only to be turned away because her family owed a fine. Charity begins at home, the attendant mutters. You almost throw your shoe at him. Still, there's something intoxicating about these cities. You can feel the ideas moving through the air like perfume. People debate Plato over breakfast. A goldsmith might also be an amateur astronomer. You hear someone argue that the moon affects moods, and no one laughs. You catch snippets of translated Arabic texts being read aloud in cafes, and someone compares Greek tragedy to local politics. It's all very sweaty and brilliant. Here's a fringe detail for your bedtime brain. One Florentine scholar claims that great thinkers are born only when stars align just right. He's working on a birth chart for the city itself. You nod and walk away before he asks for your date of birth. Last time someone made you a chart, it said, "Beware of goats and inheritance disputes." Still figuring that one out. Despite all the drama, the cities pulse with life. You walk cobbled streets at dusk and hear music spilling from windows. You see silhouettes dancing behind silk curtains. You pass a tavern where someone is loudly reciting the opening lines of the Divine Comedy. Badly, but with heart. There's wine, oil lamps, fresh figs on a plate. And in that moment, it doesn't matter who's ruling the city, or who's feuding with whom. You're here, you're breathing, you're witnessing the slow rebirth of wonder, one beautifully competitive city at a time, and tomorrow you might head to Venice. Or maybe stay in Florence and paint a goose for money. Either way, the future feels alive. You don't mean to accuse anyone of being a witch, but The bread did explode, not dramatically, just enough to make the oven door fly open and the chicken start screaming. The woman who baked it, Magda, who lives on the edge of the village and talks to trees when she thinks no one's listening, just shrugs and says the yeast was eager, but still. It's one of those moments where you lock eyes with a neighbour and silently ask, did that feel a little magical to you, or am I just hungry? The thing is, in a post-plague world, weird is everywhere. So much has happened that people have stopped pretending they understand how anything works, and when you don't understand something, you fill in the blanks. Usually with blame. That's when the witch talk starts. It's quiet at first, just whispers. A goat dies, a child runs a fever, a cow stops giving milk, and suddenly everyone's looking at the midwife's herb garden like it's a miniature hellmouth. You hear murmurs of unnatural knowledge, evil eye, and the ever-suspicious phrase, she doesn't go to church enough. Never mind that the church smells like mildew and disappointment. You hear the first serious accusation 2 towns over. A widow, known for her salves and late-night walks, is brought before the magistrate after someone claims her soup caused hallucinations. You've had her soup. It does taste a bit like regret and rosemary, but hardly demonic. Still, fear makes a good leash, and people are tightening the loop. What's wild is that witchcraft wasn't really the biggest deal before. Sure, people believed in curses and spells, but it wasn't an organised fear. It was more folklore, more bedtime story territory. But after the plague, suddenly people need reasons, tangible villains, someone to blame for the chaos they barely survived, because otherwise, they're forced to accept that death can just happen, and nobody wants that kind of freedom. Here's your quirky fact. In several places, people actually blamed the plague on witches long after it was over. They claimed that certain women, usually poor, unmarried, and just a little too self-reliant, had cast spells to poison wells or summon pestilence. Never mind that they drank from those same wells. Logic is rarely invited to these conversations, and the accusations don't follow rules. One woman is accused because her garden grew too well, another because she healed someone who wasn't supposed to recover. One poor soul gets dragged in for looking smug after a neighbour's roof collapsed. You'd think that after all this suffering people would be more compassionate. But no. Grief often masquerades as rage, and now it's got a new costume. You pass through a town holding its first witch trial. It's painfully theatrical. The accused is bound and brought to the square. A priest waves incense. Someone reads a list of crimes that include talking to a crow and knowing the weather too early. You stand in the back, nauseous. Not because of the accusations, but because people seem to enjoy it. There's a performance element, a chance to feel righteous in a world that still feels wrong. Here's the scholarly debate. Were witch hunts really about belief, or were they about control? Some argue they were tools for reinforcing social norms, especially against women who stepped out of line. Others think it was mass hysteria, trauma leaking out sideways through superstition. You've seen enough to know it's probably both. People are scared, angry, and desperate to be right about something. And the church, of course, begins formalizing things. Manuals appear. Inquisitors arrive. Someone writes a guidebook on how to identify a witch, complete with questions like, have you danced naked beneath the moon? And, do cats follow you for no reason? By those standards, half your village is suspect, including you. That cat's been hanging around for weeks and you definitely danced near a pond once. It was hot and you were bored. In Germany, France, Switzerland, the fear spreads like smoke. Trials begin, then burnings, executions become public spectacles. You watch one from a hilltop far away and swear you can smell the ash. You try not to think about it, but it follows you, sticks in your clothes, lives in the back of your throat. But here's the part that truly rattles you. Most of the accused are just ordinary. Herbalists, widows, healers, midwives, people who offered comfort when the plague came, who mixed teas and whispered prayers and tried to stitch things back together. And now, they're the ones being punished. For surviving. For knowing things. You meet a woman named Aldegund, grey-haired and sharp-eyed. She helps you with a twisted ankle, then tells you to watch your step. They've started counting the women who read, she says, and they don't like it when we get too many. You ask if she's scared. She nods, but then she smiles and hands you a charm made of rowan and thread. Just in case, she says. You carry it in your pocket for weeks. Not everyone joins the hysteria. Some towns refuse to accuse. Others hide those who've been targeted. Quiet acts of rebellion. A village in Bohemia takes in 3 accused women and pretends not to know where they went. The local priest turns a blind eye. A merchant spreads a rumour that the Inquisitor has lice, just to buy them time. You don't forget that. Here's something fringe but fascinating. Some areas begin to associate witches not just with evil, but with ancient knowledge, pre-Christian, earth-based, feminine, a whisper of something older than cathedrals and confessionals. You find a book hidden in an apothecary's cellar, hand-copied, worn at the edges, full of symbols, herbal recipes and lunar calendars. You're not sure what it is, but you take notes. The world feels like it's tipping. People want control and they're tightening their grip, but with every trial, every burning, every whispered accusation, they're also forcing more people to question, to wonder, to resist, quietly, carefully. And you keep walking that line between belief and doubt, between silence and song, between the fire and the forest, because you've seen what happens when fear takes the wheel, and you're not letting it drive. You hear about it before you see it. A kind of buzz. Not the insect kind, but the human kind. Like bees made of gossip and ambition. People speaking quickly, eyes bright, hands waving around as if their thoughts are too big to stay contained. It starts with a rumour. A machine that can make books faster than any scribe. You blink. Books? Fast? That's like saying bread that bakes itself. Sounds impossible. Sounds dangerous. And then one day, you actually see it. You're in Mainz, a city that smells like ink and wet stone, and there's a workshop tucked between a candle maker and a place that sells nothing but bells. Inside is a man named Johannes Gutenberg, looking more like a blacksmith than a scholar, surrounded by gears, wooden frames, metal letters, and sheets of smudged parchment. He calls it a press, a printing press, and it doesn't look like much. But then you watch it work. Piece by piece, he assembles words, not written, but stamped. Line by line, page by page, he presses them into paper with a mechanical sigh and the weight of potential history. What would take a scribe a month, this contraption does in a day, and with fewer spelling errors. Your mouth actually goes dry. The idea is so simple it's offensive. Movable type, reusable letters, ink, pressure. And just like that, books can multiply like rabbits after spring rain. The scribes are already sharpening their quills in protest, but the change is happening too fast. This thing's not just a machine, it's a spark, and sparks spread. Within a few years, presses are popping up in other cities, Cologne, Strasbourg, Venice. Books that once cost a year's wages are suddenly accessible to bakers, brewers, and even a curious shepherd if he's got a few coins and decent eyesight. You know a boy who trades 3 chickens for a book of psalms and acts like he won the lottery. People start reading in public. You walk through a square and see someone reading aloud to a group of children. You stop at a tavern and the barkeep is flipping through a printed list of herbal remedies, squinting and muttering, "So that's how you spell comfrey?" Even the priest has a printed Bible now, and he keeps peeking at it like it might say something different than the one he memorized. It's not just Bibles, though. It's poetry, medical advice, astronomy charts, dirty jokes, fake miracle stories, recipes, political pamphlets, and letters from lovers pretending to be saints. You read a poem written by a woman in Paris and feel your stomach twist. It's beautiful, tragic, and she never would have had an audience before this press came along. Now her words are on the same shelf as Cicero. Here's a quirky little detail. Some early printed books come with spaces left blank so artists can still hand-illuminate the letters. A compromise between old and new, half mechanical, half magical. One foot in the past, one in the future. But not everyone's thrilled. The church starts to get nervous, and not just because Bibles are suddenly landing in the hands of people who didn't go to seminary. There's a fear, quiet at first, that ideas are about to get loose. Because if a book can say anything, then eventually someone's going to print the wrong thing. Something dangerous, something heretical. You overhear a priest muttering that books are like fires. Good for warmth, he says, but too many, and you burn down the house. You don't tell him you've already read 3 banned poems and a pamphlet titled "The Pope Has Cold Feet" and other signs of the apocalypse. Probably best not to mention it. And then there's the great scholarly debate of the day. Will printing uplift humanity or dilute it? Some intellectuals worry that if everyone can read, knowledge will lose its value, like too much honey in wine. It ruins the taste. Others argue the exact opposite, that this is salvation through literacy, a chance for people to think, to question, to choose what they believe instead of just inheriting it. You meet a young woman in Venice who runs a small printing shop with her brother. She's fierce, funny, and smells permanently of ink. Printing is like bread, she says. The more people have it, the less they'll settle for scraps. You buy a copy of The Consolation of Philosophy from her and spend 2 weeks trying to figure out what it actually says. You still don't really get it, but the margins are filled with notes from someone named Paolo who had opinions. You respect that. And that's another thing. Margins. People are writing in books now, questioning, commenting, sometimes arguing with the author. It's like the books are alive, part of an ongoing conversation that no one controls anymore. The author doesn't get the last word. The reader does. One fringe benefit of all this: people start standardizing spelling. Finally. You've seen the word physics spelled 7 different ways in one handwritten text. Now the printed version sets a standard. And though it's still weird, at least it's consistently weird. And with more books comes more schools. Not just for monks or sons of merchants, but slowly, gradually for girls, for apprentices, for the curious and the stubborn. You pass a classroom one day and hear a girl reciting Cicero in Latin with more confidence than the teacher. You nearly applaud. You also see the downside. The floodgates open, and not everything that pours out is wise or good. False cures, political slander, religious venom. A man tries to sell you a book claiming that eating boiled frogs guarantees immortality. You politely decline. He insists. You run. There's debate in taverns now, actual debate. People quoting books at each other, slamming mugs down, shouting about ethics and economics and the shape of the earth. You don't know if they're right, but they're thinking. That counts for something. You sit beneath a tree one night, a borrowed book in your lap, and listen to the wind. In the distance, you hear a press working. Its soft clunk, hiss, roll, like a heartbeat made of gears. A sound that didn't exist just years ago. A sound that now echoes across Europe, spreading thoughts like seeds. The plague silence half the world. But this is the sound of it learning to speak again. There's a smell wafting through the village square that you can't quite place. It's not manure, not smoke, not damp wood, not the usual suspects. It's warm, salty, and oddly pleasant. You follow it, nose first, until you reach a stall run by a man with flour on his sleeves and grease on his smile. He hands you a small pasty thing wrapped in linen and says, "It's new. It's food." You bite into it, cautiously. It's flaky, it's meaty, and for once in your life, it's not bland as boiled socks. You almost cry. Something's changed. You're eating better. You don't quite realize it at first. For so long, food was survival. Bread, onions, maybe cheese if you were lucky. Pottage, a sludge of whatever could be thrown into a pot and stirred until it no longer resembled anything recognizable, was your best friend. But after the Black Death, with so many fewer mouths to feed and so much more land left untended, the math shifted. It's not exactly a buffet, but for once people aren't starving. There's less competition for resources. More grazing land means more livestock. And not just the stringy, sad goats of yesteryear. Real cattle, pigs, even some poultry that doesn't resemble feathered skeletons. You try your first roast chicken that isn't just bone and regret, and it tastes like a miracle. And wheat. Oh, glorious wheat. With fewer labourers needed to farm for the elite, more people get access to higher quality grain. That means better bread. Not the dense, sour kind that chips your tooth and haunts your dreams, but bread that rises, bread that fluffs, bread that smells like something you might follow into a forest. And butter. People are putting butter on things now. You find yourself eating meals that come with actual flavour. Herbs, spices. You once heard about cinnamon in a story and thought it was a myth. Now someone's sprinkling it into wine and calling it restorative. It burns your nose a little, but you keep drinking. Quirky historical fact for you. In some regions, people begin experimenting with what are essentially the first cookbooks. Manuscripts filled with recipes for dishes with names like pigeon in almond sauce and sweetened parsnip surprise. The measurements are wild, mostly handfuls and vague approximations like until it seems done, but the intent is there. Cooking isn't just necessity anymore, it's art. a social signal, an excuse to show off. You visit a town where the mayor throws a feast to celebrate the reopening of a bridge. There's music, torches, trays of food, some of it's still unidentifiable though, but it's served on clean wooden boards, and someone thought to pair it with dried fruit. You eat until your belt protests, then lie in the grass watching the stars, wondering how something so basic, eating, can feel like a gift. With better food comes better health, oddly enough. Not that germs have gone anywhere, they haven't, trust me, but stronger bodies mean more resilience. Fewer children are dying young. More old people are hobbling around with suspiciously good posture. You meet a man who's 90 and still shoes chickens like it's a sport. Of course, not everything's perfectly nutritious. Sugar is starting to make more of an appearance, especially in wealthy households. You try candied almonds for the first time and understand instantly why someone would go to war over trade routes. They crunch, they melt, they whisper secrets to your soul. You consider selling your boots for a second helping. There's still plenty of inequality, don't get me wrong. Not everyone's eating swan with saffron or eel pie with a side of spiced pear. But the general diet of the common folk is improving. Slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. Less desperation, more balance. Beans and grains are still staples, but now they come with a little salt, maybe even a hint of garlic, and people are starting to think about food differently. You hear conversations in the marketplace that aren't just, can we eat this, but how should we prepare it? Recipes are exchanged like gossip. Boil the cabbage first, someone whispers, then fry it. Trust me. You do. It's amazing. Here's the scholarly debate of the moment. Did the plague directly improve peasant diets due to land redistribution and labour shortages? Or was this just a coincidence born from overlapping trends in agriculture and trade? Some say better wages meant better food. Others argue that fewer mouths meant less pressure on production. Either way, you're chewing on meat more often now, and that's all you really care about. A fun fringe food fact? In some places, beer becomes safer than water. With so much water contamination, thanks medieval sewer systems, people start drinking small beer, mild, low-alcohol brews, even at breakfast. Kids drink it, monks drink it. You drink it and call it hydration. Cheers. With all this culinary enthusiasm bubbling up, public feasts become more common, not just for weddings or saints' days, but as community events. We made it through the sickness, one village elder says, raising a toast. Now let's live a little. Someone throws a loaf of bread in the air, it's caught, there's cheering. You're given a plum and don't question it. You help cook at one of these gatherings once. It's chaos. Smoke in your eyes, people shouting for more salt. Someone burns the porridge and claims it was intentional, but by sunset the long tables are full and so are the bellies. There's laughter, music. Someone starts dancing with a ladle. It's hard to describe the feeling. You're not rich, you're not powerful, but you're full. Full in a way your grandparents probably never were. Full in a way that makes your limbs feel heavy and your heart light. You sit with your back against a tree, hands sticky with honey, and think, this, right here, this is survival turned into celebration. You remember the days when you ate whatever was left, if anything was left at all. When winter meant root vegetables, thin broth, and hope. But now you see gardens blooming where weeds once ruled, markets bustling with choice, bread, cheese, greens, even a few foreign things you can't name. And you're learning to savour, slow bites, warm meals, shared plates, because after so much death, even the act of eating together feels revolutionary. You never thought you'd care about sleeves, or fabric, or whether your cloak was cut from last season's pattern. But here you are, standing in front of a mirror in a market stall, tilting your head slightly, trying to decide if this new robe makes you look comfortably prosperous or accidentally flamboyant. And the terrifying part? You actually care. Post-plague Europe is dressing up. It starts subtly. Tunics that hang a little better, cloaks dyed just a shade deeper. But then it spreads. Clothing becomes more than just a way to avoid freezing or horrifying the neighbours. It's identity. It's status. It's the early version of Instagram, but with more velvet and fewer hashtags. You remember what people used to wear? Plain wool, maybe brown, maybe darker brown. If someone was really fancy, they wore black. But now, things are getting theatrical. Bright blues, rich greens, patterns that look like they were designed during a fever dream. The wealthy are layering fabrics like they're collecting sins, and even commoners are accessorizing with more flair. You see a man walk past with a feather in his cap so large it could probably lift him off the ground if the wind hit right. The tailors are thriving. So are the dyers, the weavers, the seamstresses. Entire guilds spring up just to handle the explosion of demand. Silk merchants start travelling like rock stars. Someone says silk comes from worms, and you try not to picture it while admiring your new sash. Clothes are suddenly saying things, not with words but with colours, cuts and layers. A tight doublet says, "I have money and I'm not afraid to choke." A billowy sleeve says, "I own land and I want you to notice my arms." Pointed shoes so long they curl upward at the end say, "I'm wealthy enough to wear shoes that can't be practical." You try on a pair once. You trip over your own feet and almost land in a barrel of pickled onions. So maybe not your look. Here's a fun historical quirk. Sumptuary laws begin popping up like mushrooms after rain. These are rules that dictate what people can and can't wear based on their social rank. Basically, if you're a merchant, you can't dress like a duke. If you're a tanner, you can't wear scarlet. If you're a peasant and somehow end up in velvet, someone's going to ask questions, and probably fine you. The logic is simple. Keep the social order intact. But the outcome? Comedy. You hear stories of tailors being arrested because their clients wore illegal outfits in public. One woman is fined for wearing sleeves that are too fancy. You meet a farmer's son who got questioned for his boots, hand-me-downs from a dead knight cousin. He tells you this while polishing the boots, beaming with pride. "Worth it," he says. People start finding loopholes. You dye your tunic almost scarlet. You wear linen with just enough shimmer to pass for silk in moonlight. You shorten your hem slightly. Not enough to be scandalous, just enough to suggest confidence. It's a game, and everyone's playing, and fashion doesn't stop at cloth. Hair becomes a battlefield. Men grow it long, short, curled, oiled, or with little caps that sit like judgmental birds on their scalps. Women's hairstyles get taller, wider, and more sculpted. You meet a woman whose hair is braided so tightly it looks like basket weaving. She can't turn her head fully, but she looks incredible. Accessories explode too, brooches, girdles. Belts with metalwork so detailed you stare at them longer than is probably polite. Pouches dangle from waists like miniature purses. Gloves become a flirtation tactic. You drop one in a tavern and someone picks it up like you've just proposed marriage. You do not marry them. One fringe detail that catches your attention. In some cities, fashion is directly tied to morality. Clergy start preaching against vanity and lustful dress. They rant about plunging necklines and doublet padding like it's the root cause of societal collapse. You listen to one sermon where the priest accuses fur-lined cloaks of inviting sin. Half the congregation is wearing fur-lined cloaks. No one moves. And of course, fashion has its politics. Nobles use it to assert dominance. Merchants use it to pretend they're nobles. Young people use it to annoy their elders. Widows use it to remind you they've survived. Clothing becomes armour, art, and rebellion, all stitched together with thread and ambition. The scholarly debate. Did the rise of post-plague fashion mark the birth of modern consumer culture? Some argue yes. As people gained wealth and mobility, they started spending not just on survival, but on style. Others say it was just a phase, traumatised populations playing dress-up to reclaim joy. You're not sure. But when you put on a well-fitted coat and catch your reflection in a bucket of rainwater, you do feel better. One afternoon, you help a friend sew their first new tunic in years. It's just wool, rough and plain, but when they put it on, they stand straighter. You see it in their face, the quiet pride, the sense of reclaiming something, dignity, presence, a self not defined by plague or poverty, but by choice. That night, you sit by a fire wearing your own freshly washed cloak, slightly too long and definitely too warm. It smells of smoke and rosemary. You listen to the chatter around you, laughter, teasing, one man boasting about his new leather boots like he just invented footwear, and you realise something. People are visible again. For so long everyone tried to disappear, to avoid the eye of death, to stay beneath notice, to survive by blending in. But now people want to be seen. And maybe that's the most fashionable choice of all. You walk past a castle one morning and notice something strange. No guards at the gate, no horses in the stable, the drawbridge is down, unattended, and the moat looks more like a stagnant ditch than a defensive barrier. You pause, squint at the high stone walls and realise the truth. The place isn't abandoned, but it is obsolete. Turns out castles are going out of style. It happens slowly, like all revolutions do. One minute they're the symbol of wealth, power, and you can't get in here unless I say so. The next, they're just very large, very cold stone houses that do a terrible job against gunpowder. Yes, gunpowder. That spicy black dust originally used for fireworks in China finally makes its way west and starts showing up in more aggressive settings. Cannons at first seem like novelty items, loud, expensive, mostly terrifying to the people using them. But then someone aims one at a castle wall and watches it crack. Not dent, not chip, crack. And suddenly, everyone's asking the same question. Wait, does this mean we're not safe anymore? Spoiler. Yes, it does. You watch the shift unfold over years. The traditional feudal fortress, high towers, narrow slits for archers, romantic ivy, becomes more of a liability than a defence. They weren't built to withstand constant concussive force. And once a few nobles see their beloved keeps reduced to rubble in under an hour, the architectural mood changes drastically. Enter the Fortress 2.0, lower walls, thicker bastions, angles designed to deflect cannonballs instead of inviting archers. Moats are still a thing, because mud is timeless, but now it's all about geometric design. Star forts, they'll call them eventually. Right now, they just look like angry hedgehogs carved into the countryside. You find work once on a construction crew helping to reinforce a town's walls with new outer earthen banks. It's back-breaking, muddy work. One man swears the whole time. Another mutters prayers, but they're building not for prestige, but for survival. The gun doesn't care how noble your blood is, one of them says, hammering a spike into place. It just knocks you down. And it's not just castles that change. War itself is shifting. You remember when battles were mostly sword and shield affairs? Loud, chaotic, personal. Knights in shiny armour yelling things like "Hold the line" or "For the realm." It all felt theatrical, like someone should be composing background lute music. But now soldiers carry long weapons that spit fire and smoke. They reload awkwardly, squint down barrels, and wipe black powder from their eyes. It's clumsy and loud, but it's effective, and it doesn't care whether you're wearing chainmail or just hoping for the best. Armour starts disappearing too. First it gets thinner, then, in some places, it vanishes entirely. Why spend a fortune on a polished breastplate when a bullet goes through it anyway? One knight you meet, older, bitter, smelling vaguely of leather and wine, mourns the change. Used to be a man earned respect with a blade, he says. Now any farm boy with a musket can drop a noble. You nod politely and move on before he starts singing about the good old days. Here's a quirky historical shift. As castles become less useful militarily, some get turned into houses. Big, drafty, uncomfortable homes, but homes nonetheless. Tapestries go up to hide the cracks. Fancy fireplaces replace arrow slits. Someone even puts glass in the windows. You visit one once. It's like living inside a slightly haunted museum, but the wine is good. Meanwhile, cities are taking centre stage. You notice more stone walls around towns, more organised militias, more magistrates barking orders at anyone with a sharpened stick. Power is shifting from the rural lords to the urban councils, and you can feel the anxiety in the noble circles. They hold dances and feasts and try to pretend nothing's changing. But they know. Everyone knows. There's a scholarly debate making the rounds. Was gunpowder the real death of chivalry? Some say yes. That when combat became less personal, so did the ideals around honour and bravery. Others argue that chivalry was already a dying flower, too expensive and too impractical for the gritty realities of plague-ridden Europe. Either way, the knightly class is in decline, and you've stopped pretending that shiny armour means anything more than good lighting. Another strange ripple effect. Fewer castles mean fewer isolated villages. Lords can't hide behind their stone walls anymore, so they're more involved in local life, whether they like it or not. You see more of them at markets. Some even work the fields, awkwardly, in slightly too clean tunics. A few are adjusting, finding new roles as landowners or financiers. Others sulk and gamble and mutter about when men were men. You offer them cheese, they decline. One day, you visit a ruin, a castle that stood tall in your childhood, now just a skeleton of stone. ivy wraps its bones. The once proud keep is a nesting ground for birds and the occasional goat. You walk the empty halls, touch the cold walls, and remember what it felt like to believe this place was invincible. It wasn't. But maybe that's not a tragedy. Maybe it's just time. The world isn't ending. It's just trading in towers for terraces, swords for strategy, prestige for pragmatism. Castles crumble, but cities rise. Shields fall, but ideas take their place. And you, walking through the dust and echoes, know that nothing built to last ever truly does. Still, you pick up a loose stone from the ruin and put it in your satchel. Not because it's useful, but because some part of you wants to remember what it felt like when the walls still stood. You're in a town that doesn't smell like rot. That's the first thing you notice. Not the scent of lavender or bread or beeswax candles, though those exist here too, but the complete absence of the usual. No human waste trickling down open gutters, no butcher's leftovers being fought over by dogs and flies. The air is like crisp, clean, almost unsettling, like you've wandered into a place that forgot it's medieval. Turns out you've stumbled into a town that's embraced something radical. Public health. Now, don't get too excited, it's not modern sanitation. No one's doing surgeries with gloves or boiling their water just yet. But something's definitely changed since the worst days of the plague, when the streets were rivers of filth and you had to step over a corpse to buy onions. People are finally realising that where you live, what you breathe, drink and step in, matters. Cities and towns, still haunted by the memories of mass graves and empty homes, are starting to look around and go, you know what? Maybe we shouldn't just throw our waste out the window. You hear words like ordinance and regulation being tossed around at council meetings. And yes, it's still mostly men with money making the decisions, but they're talking about drainage, not just taxes. One town even hires someone full-time to sweep the streets, a muck man. You meet him once. He's got a shovel, a strong back, and the 1,000-yard stare of someone who's seen things no one should ever have to see. Here's a quirky little historical gem. Some cities begin enforcing pavement laws. If you own a shop, you're responsible for keeping the area in front of it clean. If you don't, you get fined. And suddenly, cobblestones you once tripped over are being scrubbed with vinegar and covered in sand to absorb the stench. Vinegar? You never thought you'd be grateful for such a sour, stingy smell. Sewers are still primitive, mostly open channels or wooden gutters, but at least they're being built. You pass through Florence and spot men digging trenches with grim determination, laying brickwork for a water drainage system that doesn't rely entirely on divine intervention. It's muddy, slow work, but revolutionary in its own quiet way. And water, bless it, is finally getting some attention. Wells are being covered, fountains are inspected. In places with aqueducts, maintenance crews now exist. Sure, they're underpaid and underfed, but they're there. You chat with one man in Avignon whose job is literally to taste the town's water every day. If I drop dead, you know it's bad, he jokes. You both laugh a little too hard. You also see changes in housing. People are starting to think about air. Not just the religious kind, but actual airflow. Buildings get windows that open. Roofs are angled for ventilation. You help a friend build a chimney and realise how nice it is not to live inside a smoke cloud. And there's a new buzzword travelling from town to town. Quarantine. You remember when it first started during the plague? Ships forced to wait offshore before docking, people isolated in their homes under guard. Back then, it felt like desperation. Now it's evolving into policy. In port cities like Venice, entire buildings are set aside for travellers to wait out potential illness. They call them lazarettos. You walk past one on the edge of the water, a large, low structure with barred windows and a smell like disinfected linen, and realise it's one of the first attempts to separate the sick from the healthy on purpose. It's not perfect. There are still outbreaks, still suffering. But at least now there's an effort. You no longer have to whisper about the air being bad. Officials are saying it out loud, scribes are recording it, and more importantly, people are doing something about it. Scholarly debate time. Did the plague invent public health, or just accelerate what was already starting? Some argue that urban hygiene was a natural response to growing populations. Others believe it took a world-breaking pandemic to force cities into action. You listen to both sides while washing your hands with rosemary-infused water from a communal basin and think, either way, I'm not complaining. And here's a fringe fact you'll love. In some towns, cleanliness becomes fashionable. Nobles start installing indoor privies, bathhouses. Once suspect dens of sin and syphilis become symbols of sophistication again. You visit one where you're scrubbed down with goat's milk soap and offered a pear afterward. It's all very civilised until the hot steam makes someone faint and you have to help them out by the armpits. Of course, not everyone's on board. Some cling to the idea that illness is God's punishment, and washing too often might offend the heavens. Others think fresh air is dangerous. You meet a man who refuses to open his windows because he's afraid the devil rides in on the breeze. You politely choose not to sit near him, but the tide is turning. Cities that clean up don't just feel better, they look better. People are less sick, markets stay open longer, and the rats seem slightly less aggressive. You even spot a town with designated trash days. They ring a bell. People bring out their waste. It's collected and dumped outside the walls, not perfect, but progress. You find yourself breathing deeper in these places, sleeping better, smelling fewer horrifying things. It's amazing what you start to appreciate when your nose isn't constantly under attack. One evening, as you walk back from the bathhouse wrapped in a freshly laundered tunic, you pass a child splashing in a shallow fountain. Clean water flows from a carved lion's mouth, and for a moment, everything feels simple. Possible. The world is still messy, still fragile. But now there are hands, hundreds, thousands, scrubbing, digging, mending and reshaping it, quietly, steadily, like hope with a mop. You're woken up before dawn by shouting. Not the kind that signals fire or attack, but the angry, rhythmic sort. Dozens of voices rising together in a rough chorus of complaint. You rub the sleep from your eyes and peek out the window of your room above the inn. Below, a crowd has gathered. Farmers, tanners, weavers. A few women with aprons tied tight and eyes sharper than any sword. They're holding torches not because it's a riot, but because they want to be seen. They're tired. Tired of taxes, of hunger, of being told the world is healing when they still can't afford bread. The peasants are back. This time, not just grumbling in taverns or whispering during mass. Now they're organising, marching, writing letters, actual letters, to city councils and local lords. Some even hire scribes to make their demands sound official. We request fair wages, one letter reads. We demand land that's not cursed with stones and promises. It's happening all over the place again, and you've seen it before. Peasants revolt here, Jacquerie there, but something about this time feels different. It's less explosive, more coordinated. People have learned from the last uprisings. They've stopped expecting change to fall from the sky. They're building it themselves, brick by brick, complaint by complaint. You visit a village where the tenant farmers have started pooling their resources. 1 goat, 12 chickens, 3 acres of barley, all managed as a collective. It's not officially legal, but the landowner fled during the last fever wave and hasn't come back, so they're making do. One woman, a widow named Agnes, runs the bookkeeping like a general. We'll not be poor and polite, she tells you, slicing cheese with military precision. You nod and take notes. Here's something strange. The nobility, once untouchable and aloof, are starting to notice. Some are genuinely alarmed. Others, wiser ones, start making deals. A few lower rents, offer longer contracts, even agree to let peasants buy their freedom outright. You meet one young baron who says he'd rather lose a bit of land than his life. He raises sheep now, drinks less wine, looks almost reasonable, but not everyone adapts. There are still lords trying to drag the past into the present, clinging to titles like their shields. One forces his peasants to build him a new granary after a mild storm. They leave it half-finished and walk away. He threatens them with armed men. They respond by blocking the road and refusing to move. That's how it begins. Quiet disobedience. No riots, no fires, just refusal. People stop showing up to work, stop delivering grain, stop bowing. And when someone does get arrested, the others gather at the jail with baskets of bread and sermons of solidarity. Not with pitchforks, at least not yet, but with stubborn, organised presence. And that's almost scarier. You sit in on one of their meetings, just a quiet evening gathering in a barn lit by lanterns and smelling faintly of hay and ambition. They pass around a jug of cider and talk about debts, wages, grazing rights. One man suggests writing to the bishop. A younger woman suggests writing to the king. Everyone laughs, but the laughter sounds more like possibility than mockery. Here's your scholarly debate. Was this post-plague unrest a genuine class awakening, or just scattered desperation? Some argue that these were early seeds of revolution, proto-democracy sprouting from cow dung and barley stew. Others say it was just survival in a system too broken to function. You sip the cider and think, maybe both. And here's a quirky little fact for flavour. In some places, peasants start using seals on their documents, handmade, often carved from bone or wood, with symbols like wheat sheaves, ploughs or hammers. They don't read Latin, but they sign with pride. They know what their mark means. Language matters now, so does documentation. You watch one village council draft a charter outlining rights and expectations for its workers. It's sloppy, half-legal and full of misspellings, but it exists. And in this new world, that means something. Cities begin noticing too. Urban labourers want the same rights as their rural cousins. Bakers strike for better flour. Builders want compensation for crushed fingers and broken backs. You see graffiti in the alley behind a guild hall. We built this city, now pay us to live in it. It's misspelled. It's also very clear. The merchant class doesn't know what to do. They're caught in the middle, richer than peasants, poorer than nobles. Some align with the workers, others lean into greed, raising prices and locking their doors at night. You watch one shopkeeper try to overcharge for apples and get quietly boycotted for a week. By Thursday, his cart is empty and his face is pale. You meet a man who teaches peasants how to read contracts. He doesn't charge much, just asks for meals and safe places to sleep. They used to keep us ignorant, he says. Now I teach them to write their own rules. He hands you a flyer. You can't read half of it. But the bold header says, know what you sign. And religion surprisingly starts to bend. A few brave priests begin preaching sermons about justice, about dignity. They quote scripture not about obedience but about fairness. One gets excommunicated, another is promoted. No one seems to know what direction the wind is blowing anymore. There are still threats, of course. Whispers of crackdowns, armed patrols riding through towns where things feel too loud, too coordinated. But the fear doesn't spread as far as it used to. People stand their ground now, not with weapons always, but with witnesses, with paper, with stubborn feet and louder voices. And you walk between both worlds, a friend to the field worker, a listener to the landowner, an accidental chronicler of change. You carry stories in your pack, sometimes letters, occasionally a pie, because this isn't a rebellion you can stop with a sword. This is a quiet uprising, one powered by hunger, memory, and the simple radical idea that enough is actually enough. You lie under the stars that night listening to distant footsteps and closer conversations. Someone's talking about petitioning the council. Someone else is teaching their daughter how to count coins, and you realise the world isn't waiting for permission to change. It's already changing, one demand at a time. You walk into a town square and spot something strange. A cluster of people sitting on low wooden benches, completely silent, all staring at a man with a scroll. Not a priest, not a noble, just a man. Hair a little wild, robes slightly wrinkled, and a voice that carries like he's trying to speak to the sky. He's reading Latin, badly, but with confidence. And what's wild is that people are listening. Then you realise where you are. You're standing outside a university, and it doesn't even smell that bad. You didn't mean to end up here. You were just passing through. But now you're watching students, actual students, argue about the nature of the soul, or whether Aristotle had it right about the elements, or if demons can read your mind. The debate is passionate, ridiculous, and deeply contagious. You stay for the whole thing and leave with a new thought stuck in your head. Maybe learning isn't just for monks anymore. That's the thing. Since the Black Death, universities have started cropping up like mushrooms after a rainstorm. Before the plague, there were a handful scattered across Europe, places like Bologna, Paris and Oxford. Elitist, exclusive, heavy on theology. But now, they're multiplying, spreading, adapting. Places like Prague, Vienna, Krakow, cities that you once associated with markets and strong beer, are suddenly becoming hubs of thought. And no, it's not some intellectual utopia. The dorms are mouldy, the lectures are long, and the debates often spiral into fistfights. But what matters is that more people are starting to care about knowledge. Not just for the glory of God, but for the glory of being slightly less confused than yesterday. You talk to a student who's learning medicine. He's dissected 3 pigs and 1 unfortunate criminal. "I know where the spleen is now," he says proudly, like he's unlocked the mysteries of the universe. You nod and offer him half your apple. He offers you a diagram in return. It's mostly scribbles, but it looks important. One quirky post-plague twist. Because so many clergy died and literacy suffered, there's a sudden hunger for people who can teach. Anyone. Enter the itinerant scholar. People who travel from town to town offering lessons in Latin, logic, mathematics, or even how to write your name without crying. You meet one who charges a loaf of bread per lesson. You pay double for a refresher on fractions. Women too are finding cracks in the academic walls. Still mostly barred from formal universities, but not from learning altogether. You meet a woman in Ghent who teaches astronomy to local merchants so they can chart sea routes more accurately. She has star maps pinned to her ceiling and a telescope that looks suspiciously like a wine jug with holes punched in it. You believe every word she says. Meanwhile, people are copying texts like their lives depend on it. Libraries, once guarded like treasure vaults, start opening their doors just a bit wider. You spend an afternoon in one, leafing through a book on natural history that includes both lions and tree serpents that cry like babies. Sure, it's not all accurate, but you can feel the curiosity in the ink. And don't even get started on the printing press. It's now flooding universities with more text than they know what to do with. You see a cart arrive full of pamphlets on legal theory, Aristotle, hygiene tips, and one particularly steamy love poem someone clearly slipped in for fun. The librarian looks overwhelmed but pleased. Here's your scholarly debate for the night. Did the rise of post-plague universities signal the beginning of secular knowledge in Europe, or was it still just theology with better furniture? Some argue that the intellectual shift was already underway, nudged by contact with the Islamic world and ancient texts. Others say the plague shook the foundations of certainty so hard, people had to start rebuilding with fresh questions. You? You think it's both. Fear broke the world. Now knowledge is trying to tape it back together. You sit in on a logic class where 2 students argue whether a cat can be both alive and dead in a box. "What's a box?" someone asks. "What's a cat?" says another. The professor throws up his hands and tells them to write a paper. You don't know what a paper is either, but it sounds exhausting. Still, there's something addictive about all this thinking. People aren't just repeating what they were told anymore. They're testing it, poking at it, trying to make sense of a world that clearly doesn't follow the old rules. One night, you share a fire with 3 students, one studying law, one medicine, and one something they describe only as truth-seeking. They argue late into the night about whether justice is a natural law or a human invention. You mostly listen, chewing dried figs and wondering how many other conversations like this are echoing across Europe right now. And the truth is, they're everywhere. In churches, in libraries, in taverns, in barns lit by candles where someone's reading a borrowed book to a circle of listeners who don't care about parchment or prestige. They just want to understand something new. The universities are still far from perfect. They're not open to everyone. They're still tangled in class, gender, and the stubborn grip of tradition. But they're cracking open. And you? You leave that town carrying a scroll you can't quite read, but you're determined to learn how. Because something inside you has shifted. Not just hunger for food, not just fear of death, but the need to know, and maybe, someday, to teach. You're following a cart along a dirt road. Not because you're particularly interested in its destination, but because the back of it is playing music. Not intentionally. It's the way the wooden wheels clunk over uneven stones, creating a sort of thump-thump rhythm that blends with birdsong and the low hum of chatter ahead. The cart belongs to a family, or maybe a group of families migrating together, their belongings strapped down under tarps and blankets. Chickens squawk softly from under a basket. A child walks barefoot alongside, singing a song you don't recognize. You realize something big is happening again. People are on the move. The plague didn't just kill bodies, it uprooted communities. Entire villages disappeared, families shattered, land left empty, jobs undone. But now, in the long, strange wake of that loss, people are shifting like waves, leaving old places behind, trying to find or make something new. Migration isn't chaotic anymore. It's strategic. People weigh options, ask around. Is there work in Ghent? What's the harvest like in Burgundy? Are there fewer rats in Lübeck? The answers aren't always reliable, but they spread, passed from traveller to traveller, forming a kind of whispered map of opportunity. You meet a mason who's moved 4 times in as many years. He says he doesn't even unpack anymore, just keeps his tools tied up in cloth so he can leave quickly if a better offer comes. The stone doesn't care where I cut it, he tells you. Why should I? There's a quiet reshaping of Europe happening beneath your feet. Not by kings or councils, but by tailors, blacksmiths, widows, shepherds. They move not because of war exile, but because they can, and because for once someone needs them more than they need the land. It's not just individuals moving, whole communities relocate. You walk through one village abandoned by disease and see it slowly being claimed by newcomers. The old church is patched with fresh stone. The fields, once overgrown, now bear tidy rows of barley. The graveyard, though untouched, has new flowers laid beside old markers. These aren't ghosts repopulating the town, they're survivors, rebuilding it. Here's a quirky fact you stumble across in a port town. Entire trades are migrating. Textile workers from Flanders move south. Glassblowers from Venice turn up in small inland towns. Swordsmiths follow noble families across borders. It's like Europe's skill sets are being shuffled in a giant deck of cards. Some cities flourish from the influx, others flinch. Local councils try to manage the shift. Some welcome newcomers with open arms, offering land, tools, even tax exemptions. Settle here, they promise, and we won't bother you for 5 years. Others slam the gates shut. Strangers bring trouble, they mutter, and probably more fleas. But the gates don't stay shut for long. If one town refuses to grow, the one next door scoops up the labour, the ideas, the trade. You pass through a border region where the dialect is a soup of 4 languages, and the baker sells bread shaped like a Turkish knot, filled with Polish cheese made by a woman from northern Italy. It's delicious. You buy 3. A fringe development. Some towns begin issuing migration papers, basic records of where someone came from, what trade they practice, and whether they left their old town in good standing. It's the closest thing to a resume you've ever seen, and suddenly everyone wants one. You meet a man who fakes his, claiming he was once a scribe for a bishop. His Latin is terrible, but he gets the job anyway. With all this movement, cultures begin to blur in fascinating ways. You attend a wedding where the bride wears a linen veil from Brittany, dances a Hungarian circle waltz, and feeds her guests dumplings you swear came from somewhere east of Krakow. No one bats an eye. It's tradition, someone says, though no one's quite sure whose tradition. Of course, there's tension too. Locals don't always trust newcomers. They're taking our jobs, one tanner says. They smell different, adds another. You nod politely while remembering your own bath frequency hasn't exactly been consistent. But over time, resentment often gives way to pragmatism. If the new guy fixes the mill or the roof or the church bell tower, people learn to like him, grudgingly at first. Then genuinely. Here's your scholarly debate to drift off to. Did post-plague migration weaken national identities by creating a more blended pan-European culture? Some say yes, that borders became blurrier and languages softened at the edges. Others argue the opposite, that as people moved they clung tighter to their origins, preserving their customs more fiercely. You've seen both, the woman who insists on kneading bread the old way, and the boy who learns 3 languages before his 10th birthday just to haggle better at market. One of the strangest side effects, maps begin to improve. With more people travelling, more demand grows for accurate roads, distances, landmarks. You find a tattered one tucked into a merchant's coat, drawn by hand, mostly wrong, but charmingly ambitious. There be wolves here, it says over a forest. Friendly baker in this town, it notes beside a river. You copy it for yourself. And with movement comes stories. Tales picked up along the road, twisted in the telling, embroidered with each retelling. You sit by fires and hear of ghost ships in the Baltic, of mountain hermits who know lost cures, of cities made of gold and glass that only appear to the pure of heart. You don't believe them all, but you listen. Always. Because moving does more than reshape geography. It reshapes memory. History itself becomes fluid, like the people living through it. Where are you from? Where are you going? What have you seen? These questions are asked more often now, not to judge, but to know. And you? You find yourself walking more, not with urgency, but with purpose. A town you never planned to visit becomes your home for 3 seasons. You mend roofs, teach someone to write their name, and fall asleep to a lullaby you've never heard before, sung in a language you barely understand. It doesn't matter. You're part of the movement now, the gentle, stubborn rearranging of the world by its most ordinary people, not conquerors, not kings, just those who kept walking. The morning begins with bells, not church bells, not wedding bells, market bells. 3 quick clangs from the tower near the Guildhall, echoing down narrow cobbled alleys like a summons. You stretch, yawn, and wander toward the sound along with half the town, drawn not by obligation but curiosity. Market day again. You've started to lose track of time in weeks and measure it in produce, but this isn't just about apples and eels. Markets have always existed, sure, but what's happening now is something different, something louder, faster, more organised. Trade is no longer a slow trickle of cartwheels and barter. It's becoming a system, an engine, a network. You're watching the rise of the merchant class. It starts with the goods, bolts of cloth from Flanders, dried figs from Greece, spices from the Levant. Objects that used to be rare and sacred are now, if not common, at least attainable. You hold a piece of silk once, real silk, and feel your brain stutter. It's so light it barely exists, and yet it's worth more than your entire cart. The people selling it are even more fascinating. Not lords, not clergy, just well-dressed people with good handwriting and excellent boots. They negotiate like poets, always 3 steps ahead in both thought and profit. You meet one merchant who never raises his voice, never changes expression, and somehow walks away with a deal that leaves everyone else slightly confused and mildly impressed. Money too is shifting. Barter is still around, but coinage is becoming the language of legitimacy. You start seeing scales in every shop. Debts are recorded, ledgers appear, little leather-bound books filled with names, numbers, and the occasional passive-aggressive note like, "Refused payment again, pray for his cow." You help copy a ledger once. It's surprisingly juicy. Trade, as it turns out, is built on trust, and trust is built on gossip. Who paid late, who watered down their wine, who once tried to pass off dyed goat leather as imported Spanish hide. It's an economy, but also a high-stakes soap opera. Guilds are booming, bakers, tanners, weavers, glassmakers. Every craft you can name has a group now, complete with rules, rituals and initiations that sometimes involve suspiciously spicy stew. You're not a member of any guild yourself, but you've sat in on their meetings. They talk about wages, apprenticeships, and more frequently than you'd expect, whose nephew is ruining everything. Guilds set standards, protect their trades, and push back against noble interference. Some towns even let guilds govern. You hear someone call the head of the Blacksmiths Guild mayor without irony. It's still a strange word, but one that's starting to matter. A quirky historical twist. Merchants start writing letters in code. Not military code, price code. They disguise the cost of goods in their correspondence so competitors can't undercut them. You read one that says, "Our cousin Balthazar is well fed but expensive this season." Turns out Balthazar was a code word for pepper. Wild. Trade routes expand by land, sea, river, and sheer stubbornness. You travel for a time with a spice caravan and watch as they negotiate tolls at city gates like it's a chess match. In one port you see cranes lifting crates off ships with terrifying precision. The dock workers barely speak the same language, but the rhythm of profit is universal, and markets aren't just for goods anymore. Ideas move with the same speed. You watch a printer sell books beside a fishmonger. You see a pamphlet arguing that merchants do more for society than kings. "We feed you," it reads, "and we charge less." It's bold. You buy a copy. Here's your scholarly debate. Is the rise of the merchant class the true start of capitalism, or just a more sophisticated form of medieval barter? Some say capitalism is born here, in the shift from feudal dues to contract work, the emergence of credit, the abstraction of value into paper. Others argue that true capitalism doesn't appear until industry. You lean toward the former, mostly because you've seen a merchant haggle over debt interest rates like he invented finance. And of course, wherever there's money, there are banks. You visit a city where the Medici family runs a building that looks like a cathedral, but smells like old paper and ambition. No gold lying around, just tall desks, whispering scribes, and a sense of being watched. A banker there explains interest to you using 3 pebbles and a metaphor about goats. You don't entirely understand it, but it feels important. Money lending is still a risky business, both socially and spiritually. The church frowns on charging interest, calling it usury. But the rules get flexible when everyone needs a loan. You see clerics with merchant debts and merchants sponsoring church repairs. It's a relationship built on carefully ignored hypocrisy. Not everyone loves this new system. Nobles are nervous. Peasants are suspicious. They don't make anything, one farmer grumbles. They just move things. But even he can't deny that when his plough breaks, it's a merchant who finds him a replacement. Fast. Here's a fringe but real post-plague effect. With so many gaps left in society, some merchants rise very high. You meet one who started as a fishmonger's apprentice and now funds entire civic projects. He owns a house with glass windows, employs scribes, and claims he once lent a prince enough money to buy his horse back. You're not sure if it's true, doesn't matter. People believe him. Markets become hubs of social life, not just places to buy cabbage, but to hear news, argue about politics, flirt poorly, or pick up a song from a wandering lute player. One day, you witness a puppet show mocking local tax collectors. Half the crowd is laughing, the other half is tax collectors. They're not amused. And the cities, they're growing, swelling, pulled upward by merchant wealth, not noble command. Houses with more than one floor, stone buildings, public fountains. One city even builds a town hall with a clock on it. A clock. Time itself is becoming something to manage, not just endure. You walk through a market square at dusk, the stalls half empty, the torches flickering on. Children chase each other between barrels. A merchant counts coins. A baker hums as she closes shop. You smell roasted onions, cinnamon, the faint sharpness of iron from the farrier's booth. And you realise, this isn't just commerce. It's the heartbeat of a new world. Steady. Complicated. Relentless. You sit in a candlelit room, hunched over a desk that wobbles slightly every time you shift your weight. Outside, it's raining softly, the kind of rain that makes you grateful for walls. Inside, the air smells of melted wax and damp wool, but the thing that holds your attention is in front of you. A page. A single sheet of heavy paper, cream-coloured and slightly warped, covered in words so precise they might have been carved instead of written. And the thing is, you can read it. You're not fluent, not elegant, but enough to trace a sentence with your finger and whisper it under your breath. Enough to make sense of signs, of thoughts that once lived only in other people's mouths, and that somehow feels like a kind of magic. You're living through the literacy boom, and while it might not make for a very flashy revolution, it's quietly rewriting the world. Once upon a time, like 50 years ago, reading was a luxury, reserved for monks, nobles, and that one merchant's kid who had a suspicious amount of free time. Now, it's spreading, like yeast in warm dough. Slow, invisible, but powerful. The reasons are many. Printing presses, sure, but also necessity. The post-plague world demands communication. Contracts, bills of sale, inventories, prayers, petitions, love letters, apologies. Every written word is a kind of bridge. Between people, between places, between power and the powerless. You meet a weaver's daughter who learned to read by watching her brother practice Latin verbs. Now she reads psalms aloud to neighbours who bring her bread as thanks. You meet a baker who keeps a recipe book filled with careful notes, stars for good batches, and angry faces next to the disasters. You copy one of his sourdough methods and promptly fail to replicate it. And it's not just the elite texts anymore. Sure, the scholars still debate Cicero and quote Thomas Aquinas like they're ordering lunch. But more and more, you see vernacular writing. Local languages. German, English, French, Dutch. Words that sound like the streets they're spoken on. Words that feel like they belong to everyone. A quirky development you come across. People start writing marginalia. Tiny scribbled thoughts in the corners of books. Some are notes, some are jokes, some are insults aimed at the author. You find one that simply says, "This chapter is nonsense, but the drawing of the goat is nice." The drawing is nice, and the art of reading becomes social. People gather to listen to text read aloud. especially when only one person in the room can actually read. You watch a crowd hang on every word of a romantic story about two doomed lovers from Spain. Half the listeners are weeping by the end. One just says, "should have married the shepherd." The church, ever the anxious parent, sees both opportunity and danger. On one hand, literacy means more people reading the Bible. On the other hand, it means more people interpreting the Bible, differently, loudly, sometimes in direct contradiction of doctrine, which brings us to your scholarly debate. Is rising literacy liberating society or destabilizing it? Some say it's the key to empowerment, that once a person can read, they're harder to fool, harder to control. Others argue it invites chaos, that too many voices spoil the harmony of tradition. You sit in on a heated discussion between two friars, one quoting Augustine, the other quoting a peasant woman who read a book once and decided the saints were overrated. You quietly eat your apple and say nothing. Another fringe effect of this reading craze? The emergence of personal journals. Not the grand diaries of kings, but small, humble notebooks filled with weather reports, dreams, petty complaints, and long lists of things one hopes to accomplish before death. You read one that says, 1. Buy shoes that don't squeak. 2. Learn to flirt better. 3. Avoid Bernard. You do not ask who Bernard is. Books become status symbols, not just for their content, but for having them. Even a small shelf of books, especially in the local tongue, is a source of pride. You visit a house where the books are displayed more prominently than the fireplace. They're a little mouldy, still beautiful. And the stories themselves, they're multiplying. Folktales once passed mouth to mouth are now preserved on paper. You read one about a talking cat who tricks a queen into marrying a fisherman. It makes no sense. You love it anyway. You also start seeing instructional texts, manuals, guides. How to keep bees. How to dye cloth without poisoning your neighbours. How to write a letter that doesn't sound desperate. They're clunky and full of opinions, but useful. You once relied on gut instinct to fix a broken wagon wheel. Now there's a diagram, and 3 different methods depending on wood type. You meet a wandering scribe who teaches writing in exchange for meals. He shows you how to hold a quill without stabbing yourself and how to form a passable lowercase g. You ask how many people he's taught. He shrugs. I stopped counting after I taught a dog's name. The dog, by the way, is very proud. Still, access isn't equal. Many can't afford books. Many can't read at all. But the desire is there now, burning like a candle in a drafty hall. You see eyes light up when someone sounds out their first sentence. You watch a grown man write his name for the first time and stare at it like it just proposed marriage. And that's the thing. Literacy doesn't just open books. It opens minds, changes how people think, how they see the world. Suddenly, thoughts can last longer than breath, travel farther than footsteps. You copy a poem onto a scrap of parchment and leave it on a bench. A week later, you find someone else has added a line beneath it. You don't know who, you don't care, because the page lives on, and so, in a quiet way, do you. You're wandering through a village one grey morning, fog clinging to your boots and breath curling like incense from your nose, when you hear something that makes you stop. Not a scream, not a sermon. It's a question, soft, hesitant, but electric. But what if they're wrong? You follow the voice to a group of people gathered under a chestnut tree. Not many, 6 or 7, dressed plainly. One's holding a book. Another clutches a worn rosary. They aren't shouting, they're wondering. And in this world, still stained by plague, still stitched together with habit and hierarchy, wondering out loud is borderline revolutionary. Welcome to the spiritual storm no one quite saw coming. See, before the plague, religion was a monolith. One church. One doctrine. One structure that explained everything, from fleas to famine to your uncle's strange tendency to sing at funerals. It comforted, it warned, it punished. It was the air you breathed. But then half the world died, and prayers for many went unanswered. Now people are starting to ask questions, not all at once, and not all loudly. But the doubt is there, creeping under the doors of chapels, clinging to the hems of priests' robes. And while some cling harder to the old beliefs, crossing themselves twice as often, weeping at relics, giving up meat for 3 extra days a week, others start shifting. You meet a man who claims he talks to God directly. No priests involved, just him, the stars and the psalms. He has eyes like cracked glass and smells vaguely of mint. You don't know if he's a prophet or just lonely, but he gives you a folded note that says, "The church is a house. Faith is the fire inside. You keep it." In Bohemia, you hear people whispering the name Jan Hus, a preacher with a sharp tongue and a sharper pen. He's been poking at the church's authority, asking why indulgences cost money, why sermons can't be in the local language, why priests seem more concerned with gold than grace. His followers, the Hussites, are multiplying, quietly, strategically. You see their symbols scratched into tree trunks and alley walls, a chalice, a flame. A few towns over, someone's burning books. A few days later, someone else is copying them in secret. It's not just Huss, it's Wycliffe in England, writing down his ideas so feverishly you'd think salvation depended on punctuation. It's mystics, real ones, like Julian of Norwich, who speaks of divine love like it's warm bread in your hands. "All shall be well," she writes, over and over, like a lullaby against despair. That's the fringe fact of this era. Even as formal religion frays at the edges, personal faith flourishes. Pilgrimages become less about obligation and more about longing. People begin to pray not out of fear, but hope. You visit a hermit living in a hollowed-out tree who speaks about forgiveness, like it's a fruit he's offering, fresh and impossible. You attend a service in a chapel where half the windows are broken, the altar is water-stained, and the priest can't read Latin. But when he sings the Kyrie in the local dialect, the congregation joins in like it's a song they've known since birth. It's rough, it's off-key, it's beautiful. There's a scholarly debate, of course. Did the Black Death break the church's power, or just force it to evolve? Some say the clergy's failure to stop the plague shattered public trust. Others argue it was more about access, more literacy, more printing, more debate. You listen to both sides while standing beneath a cathedral that took 2 generations to finish. You admire the stonework and also wonder how many taxes it cost. The church itself isn't blind to all this. It begins to respond. You see more sermons in vernacular, more attention paid to charity, to community. Some bishops embrace reform, others double down, wagging fingers and quoting Leviticus with increasing volume. One friar in particular becomes famous for preaching against dancing, drinking, and smiling too much. He is unsurprisingly not invited to many parties. But here's where things really get wild. People start forming their own movements. Small, scattered, sometimes strange, like the brethren of the common life, who live simply, teach children, and think the Gospels should actually be practiced, not just chanted. You meet one of them in a quiet corner of Utrecht. He gives you bread, refuses your coin, and tells you Christ never charged admission. You smile and take a second slice. Religious plays become wildly popular, staged in marketplaces, churchyards, sometimes even inside barns. They depict saints and sinners, devils and martyrs. One you watch has an angel in a cabbage cart and a devil who tap dances. The message is muddy. The audience loves it. You also see signs of darker cracks. Witch hunting begins to bubble in certain corners, born from fear, superstition, and the eternal need to blame someone. You meet a woman who carries a small stone carved with a protection symbol. "Just in case," she says, before giving it to you. You accept it, grateful but unsettled. One town builds a shrine to a local boy who survived the plague and claimed to see the Virgin Mary in a puddle. They sell souvenir ribbons. The church sends a delegation to investigate. The boy disappears. Meanwhile, the idea of translation gains momentum. If scripture can be printed, can it also be shared, in every tongue? You hold a piece of a translated gospel once smuggled out of England. The ink is faint, the pages are thin, it reads like a whisper. Like truth slipping past guards in the dead of night. One night you attend a debate, hosted in a barn naturally, between a priest and a schoolteacher. The topic? Should people be allowed to question the church? The priest quotes tradition, the teacher quotes Job. At the end, they both share a drink. You leave unsure who won. You suspect that wasn't the point. Faith, you're realizing, isn't fading. It's fracturing. Splintering into 1,000 small altars lit by hope, frustration, love, and loss. You pass homes with crucifixes carved into the lintel beside a charm made of herbs. You see saints painted beside astrological charts. You hear blessings that sound more like spells, and spells that sound suspiciously like prayers. You fall asleep that night in a chapel, head resting on a pew polished by centuries of elbows and tears. The moon slips through a cracked stained glass window. A breeze moves through the nave like breath. And you understand, finally, belief didn't die with the plague. It just stopped asking permission. You wake to the sound of hammering. Not war drums, not the call of a blacksmith, but the precise rhythmic tap of a chisel-shaping stone. When you step outside, you follow the sound to its source and find something astonishing. A wall, half-finished, curving gracefully along the edge of a town you barely remember passing through last spring. But now it's grown, taller, stronger. It has new gates, new towers, and streets inside that don't smell like despair. Someone's even planted a row of trees. It hits you slowly, like dawn easing over the hills. Just how much has changed since the last time you stood in a place like this? The world isn't rebuilding anymore. It's been rebuilt, and not just in walls and wood, but in how people live, think, move, dream. You look around and see society reshaped. The quiet, strange afterlife of the plague has now bloomed into something far more complex. It doesn't look like a perfect world. It still creaks and groans, still leaks at the edges, but it no longer feels like a collapsed one either. Cities are bustling with noise and purpose. Market bells ring. Guild apprentices spill into the streets, and you even spot a group of children walking in formation behind a teacher with ink stains on his robe. You follow them for a few blocks and catch snippets of their lesson, multiplication tables and the names of local rivers. They're not monks, just kids, and they're learning. You wander into a building that smells of beeswax and bureaucracy. It's not a palace, not a fortress, just a town hall. Inside, clerks bend over scrolls and ledgers, sealing them with careful flourishes. A man in a rough cloak argues about road repairs with a woman who sells wool. No one draws a sword. No one invokes divine right. They take a vote. Yes, they argue about roads. You marvel at how power has diffused. Still uneven, still layered in class and coin, but no longer clutched in the fists of just a few. The great lords, once armoured behind stone and lineage, are now landlords, and occasionally accountants. Their castles are no longer seats of fear, but family homes with draughty parlours and peacocks in the courtyard. The middle class, once a whisper of an idea, is now speaking in full sentences. Merchants, artisans, scribes, they own property, hire workers, and influence policy. You meet a cobbler who proudly explains he owns not only his shop, but 2 stalls in the market. They laughed when I bought a 3rd goat, he tells you, but who's laughing now? He is, loudly. And peasants? They're still working, still struggling, but not like before. Many own their land. Some lease it on fairer terms. More than a few have saved enough to build sturdier homes. You pass a village where nearly every house has a tiled roof and a vegetable patch out back. There's even a well with a wooden cover and a pulley system so advanced it makes you blink twice. You sit one evening by a fire with a family whose name you don't catch. They tell you they were serfs once, bound to a lord who died during the first wave of plague. No one came to reclaim the land, so they claimed it themselves, slowly, carefully. They raised chickens, then children. Now their eldest is learning to read. There's still hunger sometimes, the mother says, but at least it's our hunger. Your scholarly debate, if you feel like turning this into pillow talk. Did post-plague Europe birth the early modern world? Or was it just a blip in the great slog of medieval time? Historians argue endlessly. Some see it as the spark that lit the Enlightenment. Others see it as a detour, a brief flirtation with change before the return of kings, wars, and familiar oppression. But you've walked the roads, smelled the shift in the air, watched the gears grind forward, however slowly. You've seen society rewire itself. Here's a strange fringe detail that sticks in your mind. A group of villagers in the Alps have created what they call a time circle. They gather every season to discuss how the last few months went. Harvests, disputes, births, deaths. It's not a government. It's not even written down. Just people talking about life in a structured way. You attend one meeting. They debate how long the community's communal sheep should graze each week. The whole thing is civil, calm, and weirdly inspiring. Someone brings stew, no one shouts. And what of art? Oh, it's everywhere now. Murals on the sides of houses, tapestries that tell stories of resilience instead of conquest. You see a painting of a woman planting garlic in winter. It moves you more than any battle scene ever has. Minstrels sing about the plague sometimes, always with a wink, never with cruelty. There's even a new play making the rounds called The Day the Rats Left Town. It's absurd, full of fart jokes, and ends with a giant dancing skeleton marrying a chicken. Audiences love it. Even architecture reflects this shift. Cities invest in public squares, fountains, libraries. You sit in one library, a small one, just 2 shelves, and watch a boy run his finger across every book like he's touching a miracle. His mother lets him pick one. It's about fish. He reads it out loud on the walk home, mispronouncing every 3rd word. And still, beneath all this rebuilding, a quiet truth lingers. Grief. People don't talk about the plague directly anymore, not often, but you see it in how they keep their larders full, how they double bury their dead, how they treasure the few elderly who remain. In one village there's a bench carved with dozens of names and the words "we remember." No one sits on it. It's not for sitting. But even grief has softened, no longer raw and raging. Now it's woven into daily life like a scar that pulls but doesn't bleed, a reminder of what was lost and what's been remade in its shadow. You sit on a hill outside town and look down at a festival. Not a grand one. Just food, dancing, a goat wearing ribbons for some reason. Children chase each other with sticks. Someone drops a pie and everyone cheers anyway. You laugh until your chest hurts, and it occurs to you, this is what came after the Black Death. Not just rebirth, not just survival, but the quiet, stubborn, brilliant act of living. A world that didn't snap back into place, but stitched itself a new pattern. Imperfect, resilient, still in progress. And now, you lie back on the grass, the sound of celebration fading into the stars, and you close your eyes. The worst has passed, and the world, broken but breathing, keeps turning. You're tucked under a blanket now, head resting soft against your pillow, eyes just a little heavier than before. Somewhere far off, you can almost hear the distant creak of a wagon wheel, the soft echo of a market bell, the faint rustle of parchment being turned in candlelight. You've wandered across decades tonight, sat at plague-pitted crossroads, listened to sermons in crumbling chapels, followed whispers of reform and rhythms of rebirth. You've watched a fractured world stitch itself slowly, patiently back together, not as it was, but as something new. Not perfect, never perfect, but alive. And now, as the last echoes of cobblestone footsteps fade, as towns drift behind you, and centuries quiet themselves into memory, you feel that ancient, steady hum at your core, the one that says people always find a way. Through fire, through silence, through sickness and sorrow, and all the little strange revolutions of